What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if AZULA found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender, Part 7. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed AZULA. I can understand the reasons for this ploy of yours, AZULA. However, the princess sighed. The risks are tolerable and well worth it, uncle. You know that. Iroh paused for a moment to rethink the whole idea. And once more he couldn't fault her logic. You won't be coming with me, then? She shook her head. I still have to investigate the damaged ship in High Sin. I'll send a report to father, though. No doubt the whole debacle of the North Pole is still being picked apart within the palace. Iroh nodded at that, and wondered how his brother would take such news, especially the unvarnished truth of Zhao's madness. General Tachi's and Admiral Gao Ning's solid reputation within the conservative faction should persuade Ozai and the high generals. But there was always a chance that such a tale would prove too hard to believe. If he still remembered how the wheels spun behind the screen, experienced generals and admirals would be piecing together as many details as they could before, during and after the siege of the North Pole. The contents of orders and how they were disseminated would be dissected, so that blame could be properly apportioned. So would the ebb and flow of level of troop discipline and morale during the invasion, and any of the meeting minutes, or lack thereof, at every level. Iroh was satisfied with the thoroughness of the advice he offered Zhao, though he knew that all it took was one strategist to question why he didn't insist harder, or rally support of the other commanders under Zhao to protest, to turn some of the blame on him, as it was about the most accessible political move within the War Council. It had been done plenty of times back in AZULA's time. A good thing then that he had no quarrel with the high generals or those in their clique, and was practically an exiled prince himself with no position of power. Ozai might try to raise those questions, but there were enough surviving commanders to testify of Zhao's dismissive attitude for anything to properly stick. And Iroh returning to the palace to answer any questions personally should fully negate any chance of trouble brewing his way. His brother might think himself shrewd, but even with years away from the royal court, Iroh still had a generally untarnished reputation, Ba Sing Se aside. He just didn't like going back, not now especially, but needs must, as they say. I suppose I'll be returning alone then, Iroh sighed. I'll charter my own ship back tomorrow. His niece smirked as she gave a short nod. Good. It adds to the illusion. You're free to disparage me in court as much as you like to sell it. I have the excuse ready for not sending Xing or anyone to call you out for it. The old prince groaned at that. AZULA was playing a rather intricate game here, and he'd admit that she arranged the cogs and wheels of intrigue rather skillfully, perhaps better than Ozai and himself. The problem with intrigue, however, was that it relied on having sufficient fallbacks when things went wrong, and as talented as AZULA was, she still did not have the experience to anticipate everything. I'll refrain from that, Iroh said. It is better that you do not draw attention, lest someone acts beyond your expectation. To her credit, AZULA took the advice in thoughtful silence for a few seconds before she nodded. You're right, uncle. Better not poke lamprey mantis nests unnecessarily. Quite so. Despite their shadowy topic, the prince gave his niece a weak smile. You've done well, AZULA. She rolled her eyes. Of course I did. I might have my differences with Zuko, but that doesn't mean I'm going to condemn him. Iroh's smile grew. I know, but it is not what I meant. You've made a formidable reputation for yourself, and have proven your talents. The brains of the family had to go somewhere. Despite the words, there was no heat or venom in them. She glanced away then, staring into nothing. Iroh noted how her voice became distant and tinged with regret. The only shame was that our education was focused too much on firebending, that it almost stunted everything else. Iroh couldn't help but feel some guilt. He didn't know of her aspirations, and had treated her too much like the daughter he wanted rather than the princess she was. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there for you, he offered. AZULA glanced at him, her gaze still trapped somewhere else. How could you? You were looking after Zuko. She shook her head and returned to the present, shrugging off whatever melancholy that settled on her. Anyway, we'll need to corroborate our stories just in case. What kind of protest will you have? And what are my rebuttals going to be like? It didn't take too long for their discussion to finish, and it was only starting to get into the afternoon when Iroh left Azula's office within her regiment's barracks. He paused to offer friendly smiles to the two of her friends as they passed him. Friends that poorly hid how puzzled they were at the princess' rather drastic change. Azula was far more than Iroh had expected, and the prince had overlooked her qualities. Did she perceive his visits back then as belittling? Did she resent him for how he treated her like a typical maiden? Maybe he should have taken Ursa's concerns about her daughter a bit more seriously, and taken Azula under his wing as he did for Zuko. Iroh stopped as he got within yards of the main gate, brought out of his musing by the sight of Zuko fully armored and running laps around the compound with a large sack tied to his waist. The younger prince was panting hard, and his body slouched a little. Yet Iroh caught the glimmer of determination and focus in his eyes, fueled further by Captain Ren's urging. If he keeps it up, he'll be nearing the regiment's record, Shing said as he appeared by Iroh's side. The colonel gave Iroh a bow and salute as he got his attention before continuing. Don't worry, Prince Iroh. I've made it clear that the prince will be held to the same standards as every other prospective recruit. Thank you, Shing, but I'm not really worried about Zuko. He has you and Azula to look out for him, after all. Iroh gave the colonel a faint grin, which was accepted with a smile. Thank you for your confidence, Prince Iroh, and thank you for all you've done for us so far. Iroh replied with a bow that made Shing shift awkwardly. And for finding a place for Zuko in the spirit's grand design. The colonel glanced aside and eventually settled with a nod. I'll do what I can so that he, at least gets the opportunity to shine. They exchanged parting bows as equals, as uncomfortable Shing found it. And Iroh left with a rather ornate lacquered box stuffed with jailing green tea leaves. Out of courtesy's sake, the prince accepted the gift and feigned ignorance about the nature of its decorations. It's not as if the other members of the White Lotus were any subtler, Piandao especially. With her own rescheduled itinerary confirmed, Azula had only one more day to wrap things up in Zilong before she continued for Hai Sin. Thankfully, the days spent in the town and barracks were not too boring for her friends. Tai Li was happy to just wander about when Azula was occupied, while Mai spent most of the time sitting around the 11th's compound for obvious reasons. What the girls saw in Zuko still baffled Azula, but then maybe the princess had a biased view considering how high her standards were. It's hard to compare anyone to Shing after all. And on that topic, Azula waited for the sun to set before she headed for Shing's room, mustering her nerves with each step. He'd been having his meals earlier and faster ever since the whole thing with Zuko, which didn't affect Azula, but disconcerted the officers a bit. Whether it's because of how everyone acted without his knowledge, or dealing with the spirit's plans, or both, Azula couldn't really guess, which was why she decided to opt for the more direct route. She can't have her colonel wallowing or needlessly overworking now, can she? Giving a respectful nod to Koshi and his team, Azula had her own bodyguard stand guard before she knocked at the door. Shing answered quickly enough and welcomed her in with far more courtesy than familiarity. What can I help you with, Azula? She would have tossed him an annoyed look, but Azula was too distracted scanning the room. Where were they? As if answering her, two scaly, horned heads popped out from underneath Shing's bed. Orochi and Kain swam towards her in mesmerizing spirals, their wings beating lazily as they greeted her in soft yips and gentle nuzzles against her cheek with their snouts. It's good to see you two too, the princess said as she affectionately scratched on the back of their heads for several seconds. Kain, as usual, then settled for draping herself around Azula's neck and shoulders like a scarf, while Orochi let himself be cradled in her arm. The princess then returned to the reason she was here and leveled a look at him. You can start by telling me what I have to do, she bluntly said. Shing gave a puzzled hup and exchanged glances with the dragons. Azula could swear they were somehow shrugging even with their lack of noticeable shoulders. She gave a sigh. I went around your back with your officers. It's obviously still gnawing at you, whether it's because I acted without your knowledge, or the unintended consequences of what I did. The dragons unfurled themselves and flowed away from the princess as she put her hands on her hips. So, Tell me what I must do to dash. It's not exactly making things right, since it was arguable that there was anything to really be righted in the first place. How'd she know of Xing's plans for Zuko if he didn't tell her about them? And how was she going to let anyone get away with insulting her Xing without consequences? Fix this. Xing blinked at her a few times before he shrugged lamely, betraying a flash of emotions before it was smothered. It'll pass, I'll get over it. AZULA's eyes narrowed into slits. I'd rather we resolve this now. Your men and women are worried about you. Xing. She glanced at the two dragons hovering nearby. Can you talk some sense into him? Both reptilian heads shook from side to side and let out yips that sounded a bit like complaints. AZULA sighed, steeled herself, and then walked right up to Xing. Look, if you want to be angry at someone, be angry at me. Blame me. I overreacted and shouldn't have assumed you'd be too soft on my brother. There. If it helps, you can do to me what I did to him. Fortunately, Xing looked utterly aghast at that suggestion, as much as AZULA was ready to accept that worst-case scenario. What? No. Then what can I do to apologize? She asked. What can I do to get my old Xing back? They locked stares for a few seconds before Xing broke it with a sigh. I'm sorry, AZULA. No, she cut in, resisting a whisper to slap him and rile him up. I'm the one apologizing here. Make me earn it, just as I made Zuko earn his. Does it really matter that much to you? AZULA nodded firmly. Of course. I'm not that daft. I can't have my colonel resent me. I dashed. She paused, and then felt the need to gulp before the rest of the words left her lips with a frailness that surprised herself. In her head as she rehearsed it, she was declaring everything so boldly. I can't have you hate me. Xing's eyes locked onto hers once more as AZULA forced herself to bear his gaze and leave her moment of weakness exposed. Whatever apathy or lingering haze of anger in him faded noticeably, softening his attention. For some reason, the princess' breath hitched as he raised a hand to gently caress her cheek, smiling gently as he did so. I don't think I can ever hate you, my princess, Xing said softly, but loud enough for her to etch every word into her memory. She found herself whispering when she should be more decisive and bolder. Let me make it up to you. Without realizing it, AZULA was suddenly leaning towards him, just as he was doing the same towards her. Their lips met, and the princess sighed into the kiss, and then she felt his strong hands holding her by the shoulders to stop her legs from failing her. Xing abruptly broke the kiss, staring into AZULA's confused eyes for a second before he went to the door. Koshi, can you and the others check the perimeter? She heard him order before locking the door again and facing her. AZULA felt her heart speed up, but she didn't hear the thundering of blood in her ears. Instead, her attention was taken up by Xing, who strode towards her with a purpose. There were soft yips in the edges of her hearing, but she gladly ignored them, as well as her colonel wrapped an arm around her waist to pull her towards him. This time, their kiss was far more intense. She felt the heat of his body mingle with hers as they pressed tightly against each other. She tasted the hunger as his tongue darted into her mouth. At first, AZULA held onto Xing for support as her body slowly melted into his strong, reassuring arms. Then she found herself sliding a hand down his arm. It took too much effort for her to separate herself from Xing, just enough to guide his hand under her dress. But when she felt his bare skin pressing against her breast, it was very well worth the trouble. Accepting her invitation, Xing's hand groped and squeezed her, gently at first, but then with increasing firmness. It was as if he was testing how well she'd hold up against his strength. It didn't matter. Each ungentle squeeze elicited a moan into his mouth and made AZULA writhe even more against him. Something felt off, and AZULA wasted no time in snaking a hand down, where it encountered a hardness between her Xing's legs. His groan as she brushed her fingers against it confirmed her guess, but before she could work to uncover it, Xing held her firmly by the shoulders and pushed her back at arm's length. She was about to protest until she saw the dark hunger in his eyes. Xing's hands yanked at the neckline of her dress, and AZULA quickly shrugged herself out of it without further prompting. Her own hunger saw her burn off her undergarments in a fit of impatience, and then a moment of almost dreadful clarity hit the princess as she became aware that she was standing naked before Xing's self-consciousness hit AZULA from out of the blue. But Xing's hungry eyes banished that weakness just as quickly as it appeared. "You're beautiful," he growled, and before the princess could enjoy that compliment, he was on her, kissing her neck and groping at her body. His hands squeezed and caressed AZULA with a neediness that made her tremble and whimper, though she wouldn't admit the latter. His lips slowly trailed downwards to spiral towards her nipples, suckling them greedily. "My princess." AZULA could barely keep her vision straight as she surrendered to her Xing. Her hands could only grab at his head, running fingers through his hair as he worked ever downwards. And then she felt his hot, hungry breath between her legs, and the princess let out a long, low moan as she felt him kiss her nether regions. Her legs finally buckled, but Xing lifted her up even as he sated himself on her slit, and somehow dropped her onto his bed. He growled as he pushed her legs aside, and AZULA was happy to just lie back and moan in enjoyment as she savored the foreign, blissful sensations that crashed into her. Xing. AZULA could only gasp and moan his name as her hips bucked, and he continued to lap and nibble at her lower lips. Xing's wet tongue then hit something that sent her body suddenly jerking up with a not quite pained whimper. The princess didn't know how long the whole ecstatic ordeal lasted for, but she knew when it ended because her body quivered and her mind exploded into an all-consuming whiteness. She didn't know her body had been locked into a shuddering arch until she collapsed panting onto the bed. As her mind recovered, AZULA fixed her unfocused gaze at Xing, barely registering his grin or the dirty way he licked his lips. "You have to rest for tomorrow. We'll continue this another time, my princess?" AZULA gave a tired nod, and then spent a while recovering on his bed, savoring the lingering sparks of pleasure running across her body. She only remembered about the dragons when they reappeared in her peripheral vision, but the princess was too happy to feel ashamed. Her only regret as she got up and dressed herself, wishing that Xing would stop her at any point, the dutiful cad, was that she'd have to wait a damned long time before she got to resume this again, and that she hadn't done this sooner with him. It didn't take long to tidy herself up, and AZULA was confidently leaving Xing's room and calling her bodyguards who had been keeping to the colonel's last order over. A part of her was worried that they'd notice her slight limp, or that her breasts were not as protected underneath her dress. Another part of her didn't care, and was more than happy to have people know she and her colonel had done something. Thankfully, AZULA heeded the former voices, and left the barracks in a happy mood that she didn't know she could feel, and she knew that Xing was feeling the same, with how he kept grinning right until he saw her off. In the Fire Lord's throne room, a pensive silence kept the bowed audience from moving. General Tachi had his eyes bowed, though he glanced sideways to his peers beside him. Admiral Gao Ning, Admiral Dayong, and Colonel Hua were similarly abased before the throne as they finally got the chance to report personally to the Fire Lord. Beyond them, the Fire Lord's inner council were there as well, though standing in the sidelines with thoughtful looks. Prince Iroh stood closest to the throne, as his title allowed him to, and like the others he awaited the Fire Lord's answer. Not masked by the curtain of flames, Fire Lord Ozai's words were clearly heard by Tachi. "This is disturbing to say the least. Perhaps we were too generous in accepting Zhao's bold claims." "Bold and deceitful," High General Bujing amended, making sure to highlight the crime. "This sets a bad precedent for us to be wary of." Tachi could hear Prince Iroh's sagely nod as he spoke. "Indeed. If people find out what really happened, it might give our enemies the same idea." He paused for dramatic effect. "Imagine if some desperate earthbender thought to kill the sun just to stop firebending." "Quite so," the Fire Lord replied slowly, almost reluctantly. "But the fact remains we are left with a humiliating defeat." Tachi winced at that, and judging from the shuffling around him, he wasn't alone. Morale will suffer across the Fire Nation, and the Earth Kingdom might get ideas. Is there no better way to twist the news and soften its effects? Silence returned for a few seconds before High General Wulong dared to answer. With the rumors already spread by the returning fleet, anything other than the false defeat or the dangerous truth would be hard to accept by the public. We sustained significant overt losses in men and material in just a short amount of days, General Shainu added bluntly. If not for Zhao's careless treatment of the fleet, even if the invasion was doomed to failure, we could have withdrawn with far more palatable excuses like strained supply lines or enemy ploys. General Bujing cleared his throat. Unfortunately, Colonel Xing's fabrication is best suited to at least salvage some honor for the survivors. The throne room became hotter at the mention of the colonel's name, though the high generals either didn't notice it or they simply dared to continue as due to their position in the inner council. We were all fooled by Zhao, and he in turn made a greater fool of himself. General Shainu said with a thoughtful hum, and then sighed. For better or worse, it would be easy to sell that. My own dealings with the late admiral had been questionable at best, and his discourtesy in his duel against Zuko was also well noted. Prince Iroh added, almost happily, Tachi thought. The Fire Lord gave an audible sigh. Who sponsored Zhao's promotion? Admiral Gao Ning fidgeted beside Tachi, as General Wulong answered. Several commanders from both the Navy and Army recommended his name. Perhaps their eagerness should have been the first clue that something was amiss. Admiral Gao Ning? What convinced you and your peers to sponsor Zhao? My Admiral Kwai had presented Zhao's merits to me, and sought my support, Fire Lord. The poor bastard. Tachi thought even as he not so subtly shuffled himself away from Gao Ning. General Wulong's thoughtful hum felt then like a blade being sharpened. Indeed, the records seem to state that much. And it also states that you've met with Zhao personally. This was a setup. Everyone in the invading fleet had met with Zhao to some degree. He had sought them out to persuade them to his cause, after all. Even Tachi had a few minutes of listening to his pitch. The late admiral might have been deluded, but he knew how to sell his idea to have Tachi raring to join him. It must have been the same for the others. Why yes, High General. I admit my error in not vetting him more thoroughly before approving his sponsorship. With a swish of robes, Fire Lord Ozai extended an arm towards the stammering admiral. Admiral Gao Ning, for your part in allowing for Zhao's rise, you are hereby demoted to ensign, effective immediately. Admiral De Yong, you shall gain command of whatever is left of his fleet. Credit to the man. Gao Ning only sputtered for a few seconds before he dropped his head to the ground and accepted his fate. Yes, Fire Lord. Get out of my sight. High Generals Bujing and Shainu, see to it that the other commanders responsible also experience a similar fate. Assuming they're alive, Prince Iroh muttered boldly as now Ensign Gao Ning rose to quickly drag himself out of the throne room. His brother's words became harder with barely restrained wrath. Even then, a posthumous demotion with all that entails should send a fitting message to any who threaten this throne's reputation. As you will, Your Majesty, the High Generals complied. And as for Colonel Xing, Tachi flinched at the contempt in the Fire Lord's tone. Surely he wasn't going to focus his wrath onto the young colonel for this? Prince Iroh stepped in for the defense. Brother, please, if not for Xing's intervention, we might not be here at all. Colonel Hua. Tachi was quietly impressed that he didn't feel even a lick of apprehension from the woman beside him. Yes, Fire Lord. You did not report the colonel's plan to your superiors. The Frostfire did not hesitate in her response. His claim was outlandish, but with his record so far I felt like I owed it to the colonel to give him a chance, Fire Lord. It is hard to believe when someone tells you that he knows a man planning to kill the moon, Prince Iroh offered. Colonel Hua should be commended that she trusted Xing, but not so much as to take his whole regiment over. Silence followed, with nobody daring to speak for or against the young dragon. As much as Tachi disliked the boy, he wasn't going to go out of his way to undermine Xing, as some of his colleagues tried to. The colonel was a reckless commander espousing all the wrong ideals, but he wasn't some great enemy coming to tear apart the Fire Nation's military structure. But as much as he was grateful for Xing's uncovering Zhao's madness, Tachi wasn't that grateful as to risk drawing the Fire Lord's wrath. So it seems, the swish of robes this time was not as sharp. Colonel Hua, considering your merits and the service you've given us, and the spate of vacancies, you are hereby promoted to General of the East. That was good and bad. Promotion to General was definitely good, but being assigned to the East, in the almost literal quagmire that was the slow crawl towards Ba Sing Se, while might likely find herself stagnating like her predecessor, General Masa, who struggled to gain notable merits and acclaim against the stubborn defenders of the impenetrable city. Still, it was better than a promotion into the War Council, where she'd be stuck filing papers. Thank you, Fire Lord. Now, on to other relevant matters, the Fire Lord said, anger returning to his voice again. Tell me, Iroh, how did Zuko end up in the North Pole after his supposed death? That was a curious question, Tachi had to admit, and he shared glances from the edges of his sight with De Yong and Hua about it. Well, it seems that your son Dash, was it just him, or did Tachi feel a flare of annoyance from the Fire Lord at that emphasis? Not only survived the attempt on his life, but managed to fool all of us and somehow ferry himself to the North Pole. High General Wulong, tell me again what the investigation on Zhao's flagship found. The High General coughed once before answering. There were signs of a stowaway living within the storage holds, with discarded bandages and bowls. It was also noted that a dinghy was missing from the ship on the night before the invasion. The Fire Lord almost growled his next question. "And you have no idea about that, brother?" "None at all," Iroh answered immediately, and Tachi dared glance up to see the prince lifting his hands up helplessly as he shook his head. "It seems that your son is more resourceful and stubborn than everyone gives him credit for." Why was the Fire Lord displeased at the mention of his son? He must have taken the dinghy to shore and somehow found the Avatar. There was a disturbing undercurrent of spite from Fire Lord Ozai's reply. And yet he was found defeated and unconscious, a prisoner of the Avatar. There is at least one waterbender among the Avatar's companions. Zuko was fighting in enemy territory, so it shouldn't be a surprise that he lost. You should be proud that they respected him enough to take him prisoner, instead of tossing him to freeze to death in the cold wasteland. Quite. Admiral Dayong, General Tachi, General Wa. You are all certain that Prince Zuko was recovered with severe wounds. Tachi took the moment to speak up now, when it was relatively safe, before the others did the talking. He would not be accused of being too passive, nor would his presence be completely overlooked. Yes, Fire Lord. He was barely conscious when we got to him. Most of his wounds are old, probably from surviving the failed assassination attempt, which, if anything, made the prince's journey into captivity even more impressive. Tachi did not say aloud. The point still stands that he failed once more in his quest. A reasonable failure, Prince Iroh argued, though it was a futile attempt. Something must have happened for Prince Zuko to be viewed with such disdain by his father. A failure gone on for long enough, the Fire Lord stated with finality. My decree remains. Zuko will be relieved of his quest, and the new terms of his exile unchanged. Poor boy. Hopefully he'd be able to use the 6 years to rebuild himself, though considering the recent circumstances. Then at least allow him to be parted with the 11th Regiment, to let him find his own path. Being stuck in a regiment, however vaunted, as a frontline soldier did not offer much opportunity for a prince. The general heard his lieges smirk as he replied. AZULA had made it clear. You have made it clear. Zuko insulted her colonel, and by extension herself, and so she made him pay the consequences. AZULA overreached with her authority, the prince exclaimed. She has no right to conscript a prince. This seemed to amuse his brother, who replied in a bit of a drawl. Bear in mind that I had rescinded all royal privileges from Zuko, which includes the protection from conscription. You'll let him languish as a mere foot soldier? Please, Ozai, Zuko is your son, and I've been more than tolerant enough with his failures up until now. If my more competent daughter thinks that she can make something of her brother by dragging him to the front lines, then so be it. Prince Iroh's voice hardened to a similar tone as the Fire Lord. So you're content to leave Zuko in the hands of her regiment? Something made Tachi glance up from his bowed position again, and he caught the malicious grin on the Fire Lord's features. No, brother. I'm more than happy to give Zuko over to Colonel Xing and his regiment. For all intents and purposes, until his exile is over, Zuko is nothing more than a soldier of the 11th Royal Regiment. And all that comes with it? Iroh asked, rightfully offended. To have the prince endure and forced to adopt the same dishonorable tactics of the Scorpion Dragon did not sit well with Tachi. Fire Lord Ozai snarled. Especially all that comes with it. There will be no privilege to hide behind, no special soft treatment. Until AZULA says otherwise. Zuko is nothing more than a member of her regiment. The prince reeled for a moment before reluctantly nodding. As the Fire Lord wills it, he relented with no small amount of disappointment, and the general sympathized for him and his nephew. Hopefully Colonel Xing would not be so malicious as to send the disgraced prince into suicide missions. Or worse, have the prince perpetually stuck to guard duty, unable to find any meaningful feats for himself. This was an unfortunate situation, though Tachi had no right to comment about the affairs and harsh discipline of the royal family. Yet, why was it when the private court was dismissed, did Tachi find Prince Iroh smirking with satisfaction as he practically skipped out of the palace? Really, don't worry about me, Aang. The ancient king's grin was still maniacal enough to lighten the atmosphere despite the grim environment. King Bumi had been kept in a cell completely made of metal suspended high in the air, with only the barest minimum of comforts afforded to him as a royal. But Bumi, no buts, the king said with a firm shake of his head behind the bars. and then his features softened. I'm sorry, Aang, but you'll have to find another master to teach you earthbending. Your teacher will be someone who has mastered neutral Jing. You need to find someone who waits and listens before striking. Aang lifted himself back up to the top of the cell, the cushion of air more than enough to mute his landing on the metal surface. He snuck out the same way he snuck in, using a gust of air to launch himself towards a massive window in the converted hall. Appa awaited his return with a soft growl, and Katara and Sokka gave questioning looks. He's not coming, Aang said, unable to hide his disappointment as he climbed onto Appa's saddle. Bumi said that he has to stay in Omashu. Katara gave a comforting pat on the back, but it was Sokka who spoke. Don't worry, Aang. We'll find you another earthbending master. I'm sure Bumi has some plan in mind that requires him being a prisoner. You really think so? The other boy shrugged. I mean, we all know that he met with the crazy scorpion psycho with well-thought-out plans in case he lost. Which he did, no disrespect to him. And the people of Omashu were evacuated so smoothly that this city still feels like a ghost town despite the Fire Nation occupying it. So who's to say that him being captured isn't part of some other plan? Aang thought about it for a moment, and then nodded his agreement. Yeah, you're right, Sokka. Maybe he's waiting for the right time. For all you know, Katara chimed in. It has something to do with the other states gathering their armies. And if the rumors were true, Bumi surrendering was also to keep the Fire Nation busy guarding Omashu. Aang wasn't versed in military tactics to know whether that theory held any water. But he could imagine that Bumi probably had something cooked up involving Omashu as a trap. It was a consolation he had to settle with as he directed Appa up into the night sky. The airbender took a last look at the quiet husk of Omashu, and then promised himself that the next time he returned it'd either be to liberate it, or partake in the celebration of its liberation. So, where are we headed? Bumi said to go east, in the cities that are less affected by the war. We're looking for someone called Beifong. Or is it Beifong? Sokka didn't hesitate to throw a skeptical look. And how'd he know that? Is that a friend of his? Aang smiled as he shook his head, more than happy to relay the good news. The spirits told him. After what happened in Agna Kele, it was great knowing that the spirits were getting involved in this war. Maybe some of them finally saw the dangers of the Fire Nation winning. Newly promoted General Wa had finished up the necessary paperwork and transfer of duties, feeling both concerned and proud of the promotion. That she teetered on the edge of being demoted into oblivion for her aid of Xing did not worry her. After all, the young colonel's outlandish claim had proven true, and they had saved the world. It was entirely her new rank, or rather where that rank sent her, that gnaws on Wa's mind. It was no secret that the eastern lines were far more eventful than the other regions. Yet the harvest of merits there was slim for the commanders stationed there. The closer they got to Ba Sing Se, the tougher the resistance got, and the slow crawl threatened to grind to a bloody halt. Still, being assigned as General of the East did present some opportunities. Being the one to break the deadlock would bring her great acclaim. And having command of the entire front meant that Wa would have a freer hand in making that happen. As general, she could theoretically liaise with General Shou and barter for the loan of several regiments, like the Princess Fire Lancers, for example. Young Xing's unorthodox strategies might be what the Eastern Front needed. If that meant that she would have to share command, and thereby credit, of the front, so be it. Wa was not the type that greedily hoarded the intangible, nor was she delusional enough to think she didn't need any help. She'd even tolerate the brute Dao if it meant advancing the war in the Fire Nation's favor. Maybe she could also reach out to the southern garrisons. Perhaps some commanders there might be interested to trade languishing in patrol and guard duties for the danger of the front lines. The general mulled in silence as she walked through the administration district. But she wasn't so lost in her thoughts to miss the attention of someone moving in to intercept her. Wa tensed as she slowed and let a modestly dressed noble girl walk up before her. Modestly dressed in relation to all the primped-up courtiers around here, anyway. The girl's face was only lightly powdered, and her hair tied back with a simple silver hairpin. Her silk dress was absent of any metal threading, save for the distinct emblem of the royal flame sewn on her left breast. It was uncommon to see such a simply dressed courtier. The girl wasted no time in bowing at Wa in greetings. Crown Princess AZULA sends her congratulations on your promotion, General Wa. So this was the princess lackey? That explains the modest clothing then. I'm surprised that news has already reached Her Highness, Wa bluntly said, and the noble girl smiled a bit too serenely. The crown princess had foreseen the likelihood of your promotion and had prepared for the occasion. The general raised an eyebrow at that. Princess AZULA was far more thorough than she had thought to anticipate Wa's promotion. Before she could think further on it, the girl before her bowed once more. Ah, forgive me for my poor manners. I have the pleasure of being Hyunji, handmaiden of the crown princess. Wa nodded at the girl. What does the crown princess wish of me? Might as well get straight to the point. Princess AZULA wasn't one to beat around the bush either. Hyunji smiled, a bit more warmly now this time. Her Highness merely wishes for you to continue doing your best for the Fire Nation. She also cautions you against overworking and overreaching. Your merits do you in good stead already, and you should not feel like you have to prove yourself. That was nice of her. But then again, the princess did have an eye for nurturing talent, which meant that Princess AZULA truly did see something in Wa to send a message like this. The notion that her ascension to general warranted royal attention, even indirectly like this, filled Wa with some pride. She couldn't wait to relay this to her parents, uncles, and aunties, and not only be the first general on either side of her family, but the first to actually gain royal commendation. Oh, to be able to rub it in the faces of her elders. Mercantile tradition, her battle-worn ass. Quickly snapping back to the present before it became too rude, Wa bowed her thanks at the not insignificant attention. Please relay my gratitude for her Highness' consideration of me. The handmaiden nodded, and then to Wa's trepidation her smile melted away. However, I'm afraid that I also bear potentially unwelcome news for you, General. Surely the princess wasn't going to start working her straight away? Before Wa could start guessing, though, Hyunji turned away and began to walk, offering only a glance to hint that Wa should follow her towards the much less busy side of an administrative office. The handmaiden glanced around before she spoke again, her voice softer and edged with some worry. It is either fortunate or unfortunate that you have been elevated to General of the East, because I have news meant for such a general. Hyunji gave a dry, consoling smile. You've saved me time in delivering messages, General Wa, but I must apologize for the bad exchange on your part. What's going on? Wa hissed, suddenly wary of her surroundings as she was plunged into some sort of intrigue. Are you aware of the War Ministry's competition, General? Wa quickly dredged up what she knew. I think so. The candidates are still proving themselves for the post of minister. Supposedly, after Minister Chin's unfortunate demise, the ministry almost broke down immediately as various assistants and protégés fought to replace him. The Fire Lord encouraged the rivalry within limits, applying the Fire Nation's meritocracy in a slightly more ruthless manner to decide the next war minister. As such, the candidates were all doing what they could to stand out. Allegedly, some administrators and overseers were locked in a destructive cycle of sabotage and outright assassination, while others took to the field with untested prototypes, and a few more deluded individuals took to hunting the Avatar. Judging from the handmaiden's grim nod, Wa guessed that the second group was a cause for concern now. One of them, Chief Engineer Gunso, has decided to bring one of the late minister's prototypes war machines out into the field. Wa thought of the Tundra tanks which performed admirably, and wondered what else could be derived from it. And he'll bring it to the east? Is the machine dangerous? Not exactly. Hyunji produced a scroll from within one of her sleeves and offered it to the general. Wa unfurled the scroll and beheld a precise sketch of a sort of drill on tracks and spikes. A massive drill on track and spikes, if the numbers attached to every line were correct. By all accounts, the great drill should be impervious to most external damage. With that much steel on it, Wa could imagine that claim to be true. It would, require a heavy escort, one that would likely be far more vulnerable, considering the slow speed of the machine. The general frowned as she noted the specifications of the great drill and saw its abysmal speed. Then she imagined trying to stop earthbenders from reaching any part of the drill to climb inside and sabotage it. Because of course something like this would require various entry points. And Wa imagined doing so for dozens, if not hundreds of slow miles, from the front lines all the way to Ba Sing Se. Because what else could a drill like this be used for besides breaching the impenetrable city's walls? It'd be a daunting task for sure, though not too impossible. One only needed to dedicate, say about a whole army to keeping the drill safe and unisolated. I can see the cause for concern, Wa stated as evenly as she could, rolling up the scroll to return it, only for Hyunji to shake her head at the gesture. Keep it. We have copies. While the Crown Princess is more than happy to wish for the success of the many inventions from the War Ministry, investigations up until now have made it clear that this particular system, this great drill, might carry a cost of far too many lives to be brought to bear. Building it near Ba Sing Se would expose too many talented engineers, and having it crawl all the way there would tie up far too many troops in its defense. One nodded her agreement at the assessment. So what would the Crown Princess ask of me? Hyunji grinned as she lowered her head slightly, giving her a menacing look. Chief Engineer Gunso will likely be making the proposal to begin assembling the drill in the Eastern Front within a few days' time. The handmaiden nodded at the scroll in the general's hand. Study the schematics, determine how many spears and firebenders would be required to keep it safe, and then as general of the East volunteer your forces to the drill's defense. Hua frowned as she tried to find the underlying schemes in that proposal, but she had to admit that her lack of talent for intrigue put her at a disadvantage. What difference did it make? Surely the War Council would ask her to guard the drill once it was deployed. It was about the same tea. Ah, Hyunji smiled at her reaction. I see you've realized what needs to be done, General. I do, came the reluctant reply. Hua didn't like this first venture into the realm of politics. Point out the flaws of the machine to downplay the drill's potency, so that the chief engineer would be affronted and request only a minimal guard to prove his success? The handmaiden's smile grew. You'd make a good court general, General Hua. But yes, poke at the man's confidence, and he'll likely rely solely on the War Ministry's own forces to escort the drill. Wouldn't that be setting them up for failure? It is the Crown Princess' belief that compromising the whole Eastern Front for a mere chance at breaching Ba Sing Se is foolish. A chance at just breaching the wall, not capturing the city, because otherwise it'd demand even more manpower. For the virtual guarantee of compromising the Eastern territories once the Earth Kingdom grows a brain and decides to capitalize on the emptied-out defenses. To say nothing of the potential losses if they simply harass the drill's supply line and slowly starve it of fuel and manpower. Hyunji's smile morphed into something more hollow and cold, almost mirroring her royal mistress' own lethal glare. Does that sound like a fair trade to you, General? It didn't, but considering the amount of metal on the contraption, maybe the princess was being pessimistic on its chances? Hyunji noticed the unasked question and sighed. In theory, this drill would be all but guaranteed to do its job, and it would be well worth the cost in lives. However, we are not only fighting boorish earthbenders, General Hua. Remember, the Avatar has returned, and according to reliable sources, he has already mastered airbending and waterbending, elements that the drill might not be prepared for. Ah, right, the Avatar. While looked at the raised control bridge of the drill, one meant to keep it out of reach of earthbender attacks, and then imagine the airbender boy swooping in to tear the whole tower down with a flurry of water blades or a localized hurricane. General Hua humbly lowered her head and snapped a salute. Please relay my gratitude for Her Highness' compassion for the common soldier. Hyunji left the new general of the East with full confidence that Hua's loyalty had shifted that much more towards the princess. Military types tended to take either more work or less, usually proportional to their competency. Hua was competent, so Hyunji had been prepared for patient nudging. She already had some future aid planned out, all above board and reasonable, to ensure that there would be no dishonesty to potentially threaten the stoic woman's joining the ranks. Crown Princess AZULA liked the harder, but also more rewarding path of gaining her followers through clean means, which had the nice side effect of maximizing their loyalty to her. Hyunji herself had been a rescue, so to speak. Her parents had been disgraced from the royal court and had to settle for an inglorious posting on a desolate island. The princess plucked them out of obscurity and put Hyunji's parents to work overseeing a burgeoning colony, all for the low price of competence and loyalty. Hyunji too was offered a role in the palace as the princess handmaiden, though it was for the most part a move to snub some of the court officials. Not that Hyunji would complain. Princess AZULA took good care of her pawns, and was not so close-minded that she kept them stunted on a tight leash. Like many servants, Hyunji had proven her worth in palace politics, and had earned greater responsibilities and merit for it. Now she did her mistress' bidding beyond the palace grounds, often acting as a messenger or recruiter in the princess' interest within the home islands. Her roles were not strictly limited to that, though. Leaving General Hua in a good mood, Hyunji returned to the main street and headed for a shuttered tea house. A grizzled old man stood outside of it, dressed with all the plain finery of a retired merchant. She offered him a smile and noted the way he folded his arms across his chest, left over right, with the index and little finger flashing out. Wonderful. Hyunji passed the old trader and walked past the tea house as if it was never her intended destination in the first place. She easily slipped into the back alley, using the establishment's back entrance. The merchant's rather dashing grandson held the door open for her, and Hyunji had to resist the urge to flirt as she entered the kitchen. Just in time, a couple of pretty noble girls like herself, save for their dresses teetering off their shoulders, passed by, escorting an older man into one of the store rooms. It'd have made more sense if this all took place in the brothels. But if a man liked drowning in the smell of dried tea leaves as he smashed, who was Hyunji to judge? It made for a more hilarious discovery, if anything. The handmaiden waited for the storage room's door to close and double-checked for potential interruptions before she walked up to the room and slowly opened it. "Oh my," she said, feigning surprise at the genuinely surprised man and his giggling companions. He immediately sputtered and his hands gestured in the air. "Wait, miss. This is not what it dash." Hyunji aborted the excuse with a sultry smirk. One that took her months to get right, because she wasn't exactly a smiley person, and pushed the collar of her dress towards one shoulder. Mind if I join in?" The target's shock took on a different flavor, and then he gulped as his two companions before nodding too eagerly with a dirty and greedy grin. She locked the door behind her, as one of the other girls grabbed a handful of tea leaves from an open sack to mash against his face, and the other began to work her hands down between his legs. Hyunji and her accomplices exchanged looks as the man gave a mewling moan. Really, she shouldn't kink-shame, but, over already. Getting back to the task at hand, the two girls giggled and teased their target and easily encouraged him for another round. Hyunji joined along with a vapid smile as they disrobed and made a show of caressing each other before him. The man got hard again, eventually, spirits be praised. And this time both girls got down between his legs, while it was Hyunji who held a handful of leaves. Except these ones weren't taken from the many containers within the room. The man moaned in pleasure as she shoved the leaves into his mouth, but credit to him. He quickly realized something was wrong when he tasted the toxic spores from the moldy leaves. Before he could struggle too much, Hyunji's accomplices tackled him down and pinned him by an arm each, while Hyunji straddled him to keep him from kicking too much and kept both hands on his mouth to keep him from spitting out the poison. She also had the pleasure of leaning down to look him dead in the eyes and deliver the princess message. Chief Administrator Tsu of the War Ministry's Personnel Department, Crown Princess AZULA has taken notice of your rude overreach, both in having the hubris to declare yourself minister, as well as trying to slip your dirty hands into her regiment. His body bucked and writhed, but the three assassins kept him from breaking free. For your hubris, know that your remains will be thoroughly humiliated. You might even be posthumously disowned after they discover what we've done to you. His futile struggles took far too long for the girl's liking, but eventually, the poisonous spores did their work, and Tsu's choked lungs gave out. Hyunji and her colleagues quickly added the finishing touches, and then she left out the back door, while the other two gave her a few seconds before they let out very convincing screams. Only a little prodding was all that was needed for rumors to spread that the late chief administrator was discovered naked in a tea house's storeroom. The details varied very little. Tsu had paid a lot of money to close the shop for the day, so that he and his companions could enjoy a private drinking session. Then he left his young escorts to grab some tea, but after he took too long they went to find him, and lo, the man was naked and dead, choked with a literal throat full of tea leaves with signs of personal intimacy found on the leaves on him. And in him, Hyunji found it rather fun shoving dried leaves into his lower body's orifices. Messy but fun. Better than trying to smear drying semen on the leaves, anyway. Those girls were consummate professionals to not react at all, as they got their hands dirty. Tsu's death was quickly ruled as a freak suicide, emphasis on freak, attributed to him over inhaling the leaves as he did whatever it was that he did, and then unfortunately choking to death. The tea house surprisingly thrived after that, capitalizing on the weird incident. "Tea so good a man tried to smash it" became its unofficial slogan. Hyunji had mixed feelings that the shop did so well. On the one hand, the owner's grandson now might inherit a thriving business to be considered a viable prospect for her. But on the other, he was getting too busy running the place to have time for her. Such was the rocky life of a princess servant. What's his crimes? Kylan asked as she stared at the gagged, wide-eyed man bound to a stake. Xing glanced to his side, where a well-dressed young man a few years older than himself stood. The surprisingly young governor of Zilong didn't miss a beat. The condemned, he said with a sour face, is convicted of multiple counts of murder. Huh, I thought it was partisan terrorism. Xing asked. The governor shook his head. The terrorism charge would unfairly involve his village, who had been highly cooperative in turning in this scum to us in the first place. Plus, UNC Overseer Day also said that declaring this scum a terrorist would be legitimizing him, and might give other aspiring resistance fighters the wrong ideas. Kylan didn't appreciate the finer workings of all those words, but she did note the disgust and hate in the governor's eyes every time it was directed at the criminal. Who'd he kill? She asked out of curiosity, and the official snarled rather viciously. 2 civilian engineers, 1 foreman, and 14 of his own fellow villagers, of which 4 of them are children. A sudden void dropped in the elder waterbender's guts at hearing that children were involved. The governor spat on the ground as he glared daggers at the bound criminal. The bastard covered a few barrels of blasting jelly with his earthbending, and then sent the booby-trapped boulder rolling down at the newly built creche. The foreman and engineers tried to stop it with their own earthbending, but the barrels went off and turned all the rocks and dirt into lethal projectiles. The villagers sent a runner to one of our patrols, who quickly hunted him down and dragged him here. It was confusing, as it was horrifying to hear that someone could do that to their own friends and neighbors. Kylan stared at the gagged man, and met a gaze that held only contempt. You said something about partisan terrorism? She asked, remembering the other, more obscure charge. Yeah, the bastard had to be gagged because he kept screaming profanities at anyone in any form of Fire Nation uniform, and spouting nonsense about punishing traitors and collaborating whores to the Fire Nation, to everyone else. The governor spat again. Damn coward doesn't have the balls to go after things that can fight back. According to the report, he was too busy trying to flee rather than put up a fight against the squad that captured him. Kylan's gaze hardened and turned deadly cold on the man at the stake. The young man was right. This filth was nothing but a spineless coward with delusions of righteousness. I'm surprised he's still alive, she remarked. Every second he drew breath was more air he wasted and tainted with his existence. It's only been a week, Xing said. Supposedly the local judges were debating on how to execute him. The governor nodded grimly. More or less. Some magistrates are arguing that he should be executed in the village for their closure. But since the place is still being rebuilt, others have suggested to just get it over with. Then there's the debate on whether to make it quick or slow. Xing grinned. My thanks, Governor Han, for loaning him to us. I'll do my best to keep him alive for his inevitable execution. If he ends up dying, just make sure he suffers. The governor bowed, surprisingly offering one to Kylan as well, and then left, leaving Kylan with Xing and his soldiers in one of the regiment's smaller training grounds. Now then, Elder, with your help, hopefully this sterling example of human monstrosity will get to live through everything I have planned. The waterbender found herself smirking thinly, and her voice thick with malice. I'll make sure he won't even pass out, Kylan promised. She walked with Xing towards the bound prisoner, and kept a hand on the boy's shoulders to track his chi paths as he centered himself. If the whispers were right, someone or something had purposely changed the boy, and for the better. He still didn't have a normal person's chi network, but the holes in his chi paths had been tidied up, as best as Kylan could describe it. While before they might be akin to severed limbs that were left open, now they felt more like robust Earth Kingdom stone pipes with some sort of gate or valve to it. The prisoner's head shifted back and forth as he tried to speak through the cloth gag, but both Waterbender and Unusual Firebender ignored him. Xing drew in a breath, and Kylan felt chi that was not his flow in and circulate through his body. To her Waterbender senses, it felt like opening the floodgates to let the irrigation ditches be flooded. It was a potent, heady rush that even seeped into her through her meager contact with Xing. Xing reached out and pinched the madman's ear, and the chi began to flow away from it, ignoring the muffled groans of growing pain. The healer focused on bringing her hand down the boy's back, tracing his many severed chi paths and noting the prodigious torrent of energy flowing out of Xing. The paths were no longer buckling and deteriorating. and his body was not losing heat as rapidly as it used to. There was barely any change in his body's heat at all. Come to think of it, Kylan noted no cold sweat or shivering from the boy, and a quick tap on his neck confirmed that Xing was about as healthy as he could be. The healer finally looked over to the prisoner and was surprised to find him shivering instead. His eyes were fluttering, and he was slumped over with only his bindings to keep him up. "What are you doing?" Kylan muttered in surprise, and the flow of qi through Xing stopped as he glanced over to her. There was a loud crack as he snapped off the man's now frozen earlobe and showed it to her. The thing had turned blackened, and Xing gave a casual flick with the other hand to produce a solid pinging sound. A glance back at the victim saw the rest of his ear in an equal state of frostbite, with not so much as a droplet of blood seeping through the jagged wound. "It seems that I'm able to make use of my previous freezing issue. That was new, terrifyingly new. Xing could drain heat? Did you take it from him or the air?" Kylan asked with sudden urgency. The boy frowned. "The air. I tried to draw it from him, but it was taking too much effort." The aged waterbender hummed at that. So it was likely this was a result of drawing qi, not unlike what he was doing before, except that the side effects had changed. "Can you do it at range?" Xing shook his head. "I haven't tried. It feels like I can barely control it this way." Kylan nodded and proceeded to back away. "Well, that's what I'm here for. I'll be at a safe distance." The young soldier waited until she and his bodyguards were right by the entrance before he took an unusual open stance several paces away from the bound convict. Kylan could see elements of fire bending in his short movements, but the movements were too jerky and clumsy. Xing's lack of proper bending experience was clearly showing now, as he seemed to struggle in channeling the energy. There was a moment where he seemed to get into a smoother flow, and Kylan began to notice the ground around Xing's feet turning paler as it dried out. He finally punched out with two open palms pressed together at the base, but nothing came out. Nothing that could be seen, anyway. The prisoner gave a muffled scream as something washed over him, and his exposed skin turned pale. His attire became stiff, as if the linen suddenly turned into paper boards. The wooden stake he was tied to creaked and glistened from the sudden accumulation of rime ice on its surface. A thin fog wafted down from both man and stake that slowly faded as the ambient heat returned to warm both up. In contrast, steam was visibly rising from Xing. He wasn't sweating, but the air around him was distorted with a heat haze that quickly dissipated. The ground around his feet had dried to the point that they cracked. As she stared in stunned silence, the boy slid back into the start of the same stance and began to move again. The prisoner noticed and shook his head desperately, his pleas still incomprehensible through the cloth gag. Xing's hand shot out again, and this time the criminal's scream was much more tortured. His face flushed red, his once stiff clothing turned soft again and dripped with melted moisture. The stake creaked as it sweated water, and this time it was Xing's back that was covered in rime, and the cracked ground by his feet lightly dusted with falling ice. Heat bending. One of the bodyguards muttered in silent awe. Kylan couldn't find anything to disprove that claim and stared harder at Xing. He didn't look any worse for wear, especially when compared to his usual bouts of white fire. Forcing herself to return to her responsibilities, the waterbender cleared her throat. "How's your fire bending?" Xing looked over to her with a grin. "Better than it ever was." His hand lashed out, and a stream of white fire roared just inches past the bound man's head. "No cold anymore? Not even a hint of a shiver," Xing proudly announced. Whoever, or more likely whatever, that did this must have been really talented. To not only undo the damage on Xing's qi pathways, but improve it so that he could turn the weakness into a new asset? If it wasn't clear that the spirits favored the boy, this new feat should confirm it for the doubters. Still, best not to let it all get to his head. Can't have the boy be too smug that he becomes careless. It's all well and good, but your form needs working. Xing slumped a bit and nodded. "Yeah, I'm figuring it out as I go. Normal firebending styles aren't good for it. I've tried." Kylan nodded in understanding. It was the same with waterbending water whips and ice spikes. Different forms were better suited to channel qi into different purposes. Healing utilized a different level of manipulation and control as well. Xing, being so used to blasting his white fire, was putting him at a slight disadvantage, now since he had no formal bending to use as a foundation. "Well, you'll have to take it slower and have a feel of how the qi is moving," She walked over with a nod towards the terrified captive. Let me see how he's doing, and then we can figure out how good's your control. Where'd you put his ear? Fortunately, Xing had a talent for heat bending which proved more controllable and malleable than his white fire. With occasional tips from the bodyguards in relation to the stances, they spent the day establishing the initial understanding of this new art, and Kylan felt her mind race as she took in the staggering implications of heat bending. Ice attacks against the boy would be useless. She tried the forms that she knew, and all the frozen spikes and hailstorm did was douse Xing in lukewarm water at best. At worst, Kylan watched the water flash into steam. On the other end of it, he could drain out all the heat from an area and literally freeze limbs off. With Xing's creativity and ruthlessness, Kylan could already imagine the bloody wake that would follow once he utilized it. Governor Han returned in the evening to retrieve a ruined corpse. Xing was good, but not that good. It was a mistake to have let the boy try and freeze the man's tongue out. The cold air had seeped all the way down to his lungs and asphyxiated him. After that, there was no point in trying to heal up the rest of his frost and burn-related wounds. She realized too late into her lunge that she had overreached. Her senses screamed warnings as her body stumbled to bring itself to a halt. But it was too late. The monster had simply sidestepped her attack, and with deadly swiftness his head thrust out. Suki gasped at the strong and hot flesh instantly tightened around her neck, but it didn't stop her from retaliating. Her war fan slashed horizontally, but that only made the malevolent creature step into her reach, her elbow slapping harmlessly against his plates and his presence getting far too close for comfort. The pressure around her neck tightened even more, painful enough this time that Suki had to drop her weapon in an attempt to break free of the grip. Even as she struggled, the Kyoshi warrior couldn't break from the gaze of the monster before her. Piercing golden amber eyes glowed with malevolence as they stared into her, and an apathetic straight line formed the creature's mouth. The boy monster yanked her towards him, and Suki felt his pincer break the skin of her neck with that jarring movement. She kicked and punched to no avail, and helplessly watched as the boy's other arm rose up, the stinger raised in preparation for a killing blow. Suki's struggles slackened as tightening grip caused something in her throat to pop, and she found herself gurgling with wide-eyed terror. "Surrender," came a baleful voice, and though the monster's mouth did not move, she knew it was his. "Submit." Despite her fear, the warrior managed to shake her head, her eyes never breaking from his gaze. The boy stared at her for a while more, and then she heard a sigh. He brought his face closer, and he opened his mouth, and then his head broke up into a swarm of scorpions that poured over Suki's face and spilled over her body. She tried not to scream, but then she felt the pinch of pincers and stingers. Suki woke up with a gasp, the awareness of her whole body going painfully stiff crashing into her consciousness. It was the same dreadful nightmare again, with one of the more violent outcomes. The girl brought her trembling hand down from her throat before she sat up, and found herself in the comfortable in that she and her sisters had booked for the night. Across her, Kana remained soundly asleep. After a soft rap on the door, Okuni's head peeked in, throwing a mildly concerned look at Suki. "Everything all right?" Suki glanced around, and then nodded slowly, hiding her still trembling hands under the blanket. "Yeah, bad dream again. There was no scorpion here." Okuni frowned a little, and then slipped back out to resume her night watch, leaving Suki to sigh as she slumped down into the bed. The nightmares were infrequent, but their disturbing vividness always left her shaken. What was worse was that there were different endings to the nightmare. This was the first time she recalled the scorpion's face turning into a swarm like that. Previously, either the pincer around her neck snapped close to decapitate her, or the stinger came down to burst an eye or pierce her forehead. Or, Suki chewed at her lip as she recalled the other endings. Or she would admit defeat, and then the pincer would let go of her throat, only to slice through her armor. Or the stinger would not come down, but strike upwards, between, banishing the unwelcome recollection with a sharp shake of her head. Suki rolled to one side and closed her eyes tightly, forcing herself to recall other things as she tried to go back to sleep. She was surprisingly rested enough in the following morning, and led her Kyoshi warriors onwards without stumbling or slouching like the first few times. This stretch of their journey this time didn't take too long. They met a passing wagon going their way, and the merchant on it had been generous enough to offer them a lift in exchange for some questions about the Kyoshi warriors. It was a small price to pay, and the girls enjoyed basking in the barely restrained awe of the trader and his family. After weeks of wandering, the Kyoshi warriors finally reached the most dreaded destination. Suki and her friends traded looks to draw support from each other's strength before they stepped into the colony of Zilong. As it has been in earlier encounters, the arrival of the Kyoshi warriors drew many stares. But by now Suki had learned to ignore the curious looks directed at her group, or the mild annoyance of the local guards. Throughout their journey within the Fire Nation's territory, the patrols and town guards had always kept a wary eye on the painted warriors. But never once had things escalated beyond some questioning. A captain or two might be overtly suspicious and disapproving of their presence, but nothing even close to harassment came from the meetings. Suki would take suspicion over leering looks any day, though, and begrudgingly admitted that from all she's seen so far, the Fire Nation were far less oppressive overlords than she'd expected them to be. Oh sure, it was a recent change, and the older overlords were practically interchangeable with the fouler Earth Kingdom rulers Suki had the displeasure to know, but that made things all the more impressive. The heir to the Fire Nation's throne, the crown princess no older than Suki herself, had decided to take over and administer to the colonies with, according to some villagers lucky enough to witness it, ruthless compassion, doing an about-turn in their governing policy that focused on bettering the lives of its conquered people. The changes had made the common townsfolk and villagers treat Princess AZULA with respect that made her seem like a saint at times. The Kyoshi warriors had passed by once derelict towns being rebuilt, and on 2 occasions part of the laborers included former officials who had been demoted by their princess. Taxes had been lightened by almost 1/3, apparently after the princess' own officials did some digging into corrupt governors and magistrates and corrected the rates. Her new colonial magistrates had more integrity and were far more lenient, as were the frequent patrols she ordered to keep the lands safe. With stories like that being spread around liberally, it was little wonder that Princess AZULA won the hearts of the conquered territories. On the one hand, Suki found such veneration by former Earth Kingdom people to be disturbing at the very least, especially the refugees that spat on the names of the lieges they fled from. But yet, as much as she wanted to dislike the princess, Suki had to admit that AZULA was doing a lot of good, even if part of that good included having the infamous scorpion dragon on a leash. Some said the princess used her charm and wit to keep the young dragon loyal. Others insisted that she fed her regiment criminals to sate their bloodlust. And then there were groups that speculated that she had his family hostage or held some other great advantage to keep the psychopath obedient. More controversially, a few whispers dared hint that the princess willingly sold herself to the monster of the north in exchange for his loyalty. Suki liked to forget that those rumors existed, but every now and then some drunkard would spout it, only to be quickly silenced, often violently, by those around them. And now, she and her warriors were in the lair of the dragon itself. The colony town of Zilong proudly boasted that it hosted the colonial barracks of the 11th Royal Regiment, the Princess Fire Lancers. It said so on the sign on their way in. After parting with the merchant, they secured lodging for the night before exploring the town. And there was much to explore. Compared to the other colonies, Zilong showed more signs of prosperity. It was bustling with activity, just like the other towns they had visited. But there was something more to it. The buildings were no bigger, but there was a clean shine to them that made them feel better. Merchants dressed in distinctive Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom attire manned stalls side by side. But there was significantly more Fire Nation red lining the streets than Earth Kingdom green here that the other colonies didn't have. The clash of green and red extended to the townsfolk, and though many wore elements of both, it was hard to ignore the higher number of red-robed officials walking about. Many had shades of green tastefully sewn into their robes, and some even sported badger mole designs. But regardless, it was clear that Zilong was the closest thing to an administrative capital for the colonies. Only the guards were exclusively Fire Nation in their attire, and Suki noticed that they were far more keen-eyed and far more polite. The ones that stopped to question them even addressed them as ma'ams with a passable smile. "Ah, the crown princess had expected your arrival," one guard said, and for some reason that conjured up the image of a smugly smirking princess, which annoyed Suki. "Please head to the governor's office. I'm told that your stay here will be catered for." Suki was sure that there was an insult buried in that offer somewhere, but their curiosity made them follow the directions to a large building of white walls and red and green corners. To Suki's growing annoyance, the officials that saw the Kyoshi warriors walk in bowed in greeting. "Oh, welcome, warriors of Kyoshi Island. Please, have a seat and I'll have things prepared shortly." "Have what prepared?" "A gift from the crown princess." "It'll be just a moment." The man left before any questions could be asked, and then returned shortly after with a jingling pouch and a small scroll. The pouch contained a mix of Fire Nation Ban and Earth Kingdom Yuan. Suki unfurled the scroll, which simply read, "Payment for the safe transport of potential Fire Nation civilians. From a grateful princess to renowned warriors. Don't antagonize Xing." The official bowed again as he remembered something. "Oh, if you would not mind telling me where you are lodged, if you already are?" Suki blinked, but saw no harm in answering that. "Thank you. We will send someone over shortly. As per the Crown Princess orders, your stay in Zilong will be paid for from her personal funds." Was this a bribe? Or was AZULA just showing off her station? Regardless, the now puzzled Kyoshi warriors left the administrative building and decided to spend the rest of the day sightseeing. As usual, they sought out the poorer part of town, and as usual, the Fire Nation guards did not do anything to dissuade them. Not that Suki expected the place to be in a state of decrepit squalor. Like the other colonies she'd visited, Zilong's poorer quarters showed off far less shine, and its streets were narrower. But things were still relatively clean and orderly. More importantly, there was a sense of busy purpose to the adults here, and few people were milling about idly. Everyone was either rushing out to work or coming back from it, or looking after children, or doing housework. Suki hadn't had the chance to see the equivalent in Earth Kingdom cities, but she sincerely hoped that it was at least as good as what these people had. That the stories of cramped, overpopulated alleys filled with broken people and waste were a thing of the past. The Kyoshi warriors spent an hour walking through the district in the vain hopes of finding anything incriminating, any dark secret about Fire Nation rule, before they moved on to the markets. There, Suki and the sisters drew many eyes as usual, and apparently AZULA's order was already in effect because the vendors were more than happy to give away their wares to the warriors. The guards even stepped in when some traders were being too insistent on offering their wares, especially those dealing with trinkets. It was only until one trader practically begged that it dawned on Suki. "Please take this. It's the least I can do for the great Kyoshi warriors as honored guests of the Crown Princess." Suki suppressed a shudder when she realized that not only was AZULA tying her name with the Kyoshi warriors, but none of the people here forcing their wares on them were doing it out of fear or easy money. Supposedly AZULA would be paying them for it, after all. By their proud smiles, these vendors were genuinely enthusiastic about giving stuff away to AZULA's guests. They were eager to prove the quality of their wares to honored visitors. As Suki processed the disturbing thought, a voice called out from behind her that caused her hand to shoot straight to cover her throat. "Oh, fancy seeing you here." She turned to the familiar voice and found the scorpion wearing an amused smirk. Despite the sudden rush of emotion, the leader of the Kyoshi warriors also noted how the crowd around them became much more subdued in his presence. Even the guard were fidgeting. "You." That was all Suki could say, though she had to raise a hand slightly to force her fellow warriors back at ease. "Yemi." His smirk faded as a frown formed on his face. "Are you hurt?" Suki then remembered her hand still wrapped around her neck and willed it down to her side. "And no, it's nothing." The scorpion gave her a look for a second before shrugging it off, and then bowing politely, "If you say so. I'll leave you ladies to your leisure and not ruin your enjoyment any further. Please enjoy Zilong." As she stared at his departing back, Suki was torn between rushing over to strike him down and asking him to stay. She struggled to figure out why, even if her neck felt exposed at the thought of it. Thankfully, she did neither, and the Kyoshi warriors retired for the evening for an interesting first day in prosperous Zilong. Relatively, because Suki had the nightmare again, and when she awoke she resolved herself to try to put an end to it. With face unpainted and dressed in a commoner's outfit, the warrior headed for the barracks of the 11th Royal Regiment as soon as dawn broke out. She didn't even wait for breakfast, or fully clean off the dampness between her legs. Koshi was used to an eventful life as Xing's bodyguard, but even he was surprised that the colonel had a visitor so early in the morning. The troops at the gate had said it was a rather angry young woman looking for a meeting with Xing. and Koshi racked his brain for any possible offense Xing might have caused right up until they reached the entrance. He didn't recognize the restless girl, but her voice was definitely familiar. "Excuse me, miss." Xing began with the usual courtesy bow. "But what can I help you with?" The girl huffed, her features stuck between a pout and a scowl. "Xing, I challenge you to a duel." Xing startled a bit in recognition, but admittedly it took a few more seconds for Koshi to realize that this was the Kyoshi warrior they had met the day before and back on their island. "A duel?" the colonel asked with naked confusion. She gave a determined nod. "You bested me back then, but I want a rematch." Koshi saw his charge press a palm against his forehead as he muttered softly, "It's too early for this." Xing let out a heavy sigh before he addressed the Kyoshi warrior again. "If this is a duel, what's at stake?" That gave the girl pause, and her mask of determination was instantly replaced with one of puzzlement. "Huh." Xing sighed again. "Suki, duels usually are held to settle something. Honor, claims, and so on. Well, then consider this a matter of honor. Shit. Look, whatever I did to annoy you, can we settle it differently?" The Kyoshi warrior put her hands on her hips, glaring daggers at the colonel. "Shit," Xing cursed again. "Can I just admit defeat now? I'll let you spree a dash. No? There's no way to get out of this?" "No." Xing paused to glance at Koshi and the other soldiers, and everyone could only offer shrugs in return. This was the first time someone had so brazenly come up to the barracks like this. "Fine," he relented with a sigh, "but it's a non-lethal duel. And since you're not a bender, I'll not use my fire against you. Yield or incapacitation to determine the loser." The girl looked even more affronted at that, but she folded her arms and nodded. "Fine." Xing led the Kyoshi warrior Suki towards the nearest sparring ground, gathering a crowd as soldiers woke up to the unusual commotion. "What's going on?" Captain Ping asked, and Ahan scratched his head trying to explain. "Some girl came up to challenge the colonel to a duel." "The hell did Xing do?" Weikong interjected, glancing at Koshi. "Nothing," the bodyguard answered honestly. "We ran into the Kyoshi warriors yesterday at the market, but the interaction was minimal." "Kyoshi warriors, huh?" Ping asked speculatively, staring at the girl taking her place in the sparring grounds. "Did he do something to her last time he went to their island?" Koshi sifted through his memory for a moment before answering. "She was their leader. Xing defeated her." "Ah, personal honor, then." The soldiers within earshot of Weikong nodded at the captain's assessment, but Ping looked skeptical. "There might be more to it." Captain Sungo announced his arrival out of the shadows with a thoughtful hum. "Espionage, perhaps." "It's always espionage for you." The scout captain shrugged. "Doesn't mean I'm wrong." Koshi looked at the two unarmed combatants, sizing each other up, and tried to put the pieces together. That idea did have merit. It could be possible that this Suki came up to learn more about Xing, possibly to decipher his fighting style. If that was the case, to what end? Was she looking to study him for a weakness to exploit? But he was not bending, so their information would be incomplete. Was this an assassination attempt, then? Was the Kyoshi warrior banking on a level playing field to take Xing out? No, that was suicidal and futile. Even out of armor, a normal firebender would hardly fall prey to an unarmed assassin, let alone Xing. Still, Koshi kept his guard up, ready to dive into the field. A glance to his fellow bodyguards was all it took for them to get the message and prepare as well. Wufang and Quan led some to surround the perimeter, while Yen moved to add another layer of interception between the sparring grounds and the gate, just in case. The captains noticed the bodyguard's movement and threw quizzical looks at Koshi. "Expecting trouble?" Ruffin asked warily. "Not sure, but it's possible." The duel began before he could say anything more. Suki charged in with a defiant roar, her arms out in a peculiar guard position that Koshi only saw in historical manuals. She had to quickly dodge aside, though, when Xing suddenly shot towards her with a roar. "Genocide cutter." Koshi winced as the sweeping kicks lashed out, trailing smoke from the bursts of fire Xing used to pull off an otherwise impossible move. The flying kicks were slower than usual, and was clearly restrained in its strength. The bodyguard also remembered the first few times the boy had tried it, far back before he became colonel. Such was his fire bending that Xing suffered dislocated legs and torn muscles from the initial attempts, but managed to eventually master the impractical move after constantly breaking Colonel Li Dai's order against practicing it. It apparently was worth it, because the first time Xing used it in combat, He broke his feet in exchange for literally tearing off the heads of 2 Earth Kingdom officers. "You said you weren't going to firebend," the Kyoshi warrior yelled out. Xing flashed an annoying grin. "I said I wasn't going to use my fire against you. Nothing about using my fires to help me move." Suki seemed like she wanted to grumble. But then she had to leap aside as the colonel launched himself forwards with an upwards hook. She tried to retaliate by sweeping her legs out to trip him, but Xing simply skipped back out of range. The Kyoshi warrior growled in growing frustration as she got back up and adopted a more defensive pose. Xing smirked, and then lunged at her with a fist leading the way. The girl didn't take the bait, and dodged right out of the way, probably her honed warrior's instincts warning her of the trap. Those instincts let her put up an impressive fight, as she eventually adopted a pattern of anticipating Xing's attacks and improvising a suitable retaliation. She managed to stay clear of him and land several glancing blows, but those were far from being able to slow Xing down. The colonel had fought on with grievous wounds on the battlefield. Compared to that, this duel was a sport to him, and everyone, an annoyed Suki included, knew it. And compared to the spars with the princess, this was a much tamer affair. Koshi's sense of looming danger wasn't even tickled. Eventually, after a few minutes of trading blows, the Kyoshi warrior fell so much into her pattern that Xing exploited it. He rushed at her with a fist cocked back, and she skipped out of the way at the last second. Xing's leg quickly shot up, landing his first hit on Suki and sending her stumbling backwards. Before she could fully recover, he lunged at her again, this time leading with an elbow. Off balance, Suki raised her arms in front of her to block the attack. The force of it broke through her guard and knocked her back even more. And then Xing suddenly shot up with a burst of fire from his legs, and dove back down with a downwards kick that struck the Kyoshi warrior on her shoulder with enough force to send her spinning as she fell. Xing knelt beside her as she struggled to rise up, and the tone of his voice was admirably restrained rather than mocking. "This is the part where, if we were fighting for real, I either knock you out or accidentally break your neck. Yield." Suki coughed and shook her head sharply before she answered him with a dark glare. Fine. You win." All of Koshi's expectations about intrigue and assassination flew out the window when he saw the flash in the warrior's eyes. He shared a look with his comrades, the captains especially noticing it as well. Ping wore an all-too-wide and stupid grin on her face, while Ruffin was muttering something that was starting to annoy Sungo. The colonel offered Suki a hand, and she stared at it for a second before taking it to get back up. "Thank you for being understanding, and for the fight," the girl snorted, wearing her defeat poorly. "It wasn't much of a fight for you." Koshi felt a sudden worry when Xing gave a warm and reassuring smile. "It's the first time I got to use a bunch of those moves in the sparring field. You've no idea how hard it is to find people that I can spar with on that level. Thanks, I guess." The bodyguard saw another telltale flash in the Kyoshi warrior's demeanor as she mulled his words, and he decided then that he'd better be the one to inform the princess, at least before Ping and her sense of drama does. "So, I hope that the matter's settled?" Xing asked, and the girl gave a hum before she nodded reluctantly. Yeah, I guess so. Care for a break? Breakfast should be ready in the mess hall now." Suki paused for a second before accepting the offer, and as the 2 combatants finally left the sparring grounds, the crowd dispersed. Han, the nearest Han, stopped trying to slink off and turned to the colonel at attention. "Please guide our guest to the mess hall for a meal." "Captain Ping." "Yes, sir," Ping drawled in reply as she reported to him. Xing let out a heavy, weary sigh. Please don't make this a bigger deal than it is." "Sir," the captain had the audacity to feign ignorance. Xing gave her a half-hearted glare. "You're going to write to Ruin and AZULA." "I am." On second thought, Mosey. "Sir, report this to AZULA. Keep to the facts, and use words to emphasize that Suki is just here to get her previous defeat out of her system. Harmless encounter. Orange ribbon priority." Ping pouted at that, but Xing ignored her and headed back towards his room. "I'm going to see if I can get another hour of sleep. Wake me up if anything happens, Koshi." Despite the earlier match, Suki found the soldiers around her rather friendly. Friendlier than the town guards, at least. Apparently, many were genuinely impressed at her showing, and some of the officers were gushing in their praise. "You Kyoshi warriors really are a different breed. It's a good thing we don't see much of your caliber in the Earth Kingdom armies," a wiry captain said. "Would have caused hell for us. But I lost." Suki couldn't help but reply over her half-eaten bowl of stew. You stalled him for long enough and barely got hit, he answered with a wave of his hand. On the battlefield, those seconds can mean extra spears or benders coming to help you. We were often badly outnumbered back then. But Xing would be firebending in real combat, she thought. As if sensing that, the captain snorted. His firebending's powerful, but his body couldn't handle long uses. So he either destroys everything around him, or he fights a bit like how he did against you, just bloodier, and with firebending thrown in. The soldiers around the captain were nodding at the information as if it was new to them. And Suki went back to her meal when the officer went on to answer someone's question. Suki had just finished her rather heavy breakfast when another officer, a woman with a bright smile, sat right next to her. So, Kyoshi warrior, huh? Yes. Your honor's satisfied then? Despite the wording, the question bore no hidden threat or malice. Instead, Suki sensed an undercurrent of mischief. She mulled through the question before settling for an answer. For now, I know when I'm beaten. The woman's smile turned from dazzling to warm and consoling. Don't worry about it. If it's any consolation, I think you'd still wipe the floor against any of our non-benders here. And probably half of our firebenders even. It's a struggle to reach Xing's level. So she wasn't as badly matched against Xing as she had thought. That was not that bad to hear, admittedly. Now, if you got the time, maybe we can do an exchange? Suki frowned at the question. What kind of exchange? She asked back. If you can offer to teach us some of your moves, we might be able to teach you some of ours that might be useful to the renowned Kyoshi warriors. Suki's frown deepened. On the one hand, that wasn't a bad deal. If the 11th fought like their colonel, there was value in learning from them. Xing's moves definitely showed promise against benders of any sort. But on the other hand, teaching them Kyoshi warrior stances might be dangerous. Even if the fighting style was geared towards subduing criminals and bandits, and was mostly incompatible with actual combat, Suki didn't like the notion of being in any way responsible for future Fire Nation atrocities. The captain noticed her conflicted expression and grinned. If you want, I might be able to convince our colonel to dash. Her words were interrupted when a commotion caught everyone's attention. Outside the mess hall, Suki spied an officious-robed figure walking hastily past, and judging from the way the officers around her got up to follow after, it must be some sort of important announcement. Taking that as her cue, Suki earnestly thanked the soldiers around her for their hospitality and left the barracks. Her walk back to town was far from unpleasant, but it was concerning in a different way. Rather than wallow in defeat, Suki chose to take some heart in the praise of the soldiers at her skill. She was a good fighter by their standards, and they had revealed Xing's weakness in his stamina. That meant that Suki now had something to plan around if they ever fought again. And despite thinking of her defeats, both old and new, her neck no longer felt so exposed. Now, if only she could focus on recalling how Xing moved in his attacks, and not fixate on just how good he looked as he pulled those moves off. Disappointingly, finding the culprits once they reached High Sin was effortlessly easy. Despite the blasted wreck of Zuko's cruiser being left there for a while already, the saboteurs didn't think about returning to clean it of evidence, which meant that AZULA had quickly spotted a burnt piece of wood sporting the seared brand of its manufacturer. The barrel of blasting jelly was not the product of any of the hundreds of Fire Nation military war factories, which would otherwise require tediously searching for further information like factory of origin and such, but had been made locally within the continent. That narrowed things down significantly. AZULA only needed to threaten her less than a dozen people from the governor's office down to the docks before she found the production site. And then it was a quick trip with a small colonial army down to the seedy merchant's pier, with Admiral Dayong so helpfully lending her a few squadrons of battleships to enforce a blockade. With the army locking down its land borders and its waterways shut down, AZULA decided to wait for a day before entering the smuggler's port. Instead, she sent over a messenger ahead of her to deliver the terms. Hopefully it'd let the thieves and looters stew for a bit towards making the right decision. You're treating this like a battle, Mai had remarked in her usual flat tone, and the princess shrugged. A message has to be sent. Even disgraced, Zuzu is a member of the royal family. Useful or not, this town is not invaluable. So why do you need us for, when you have all these soldiers to order around? AZULA rolled her eyes at her dour friend. Because I hadn't expected the perpetrators to be so inept, and I could use both of your help bringing them down when they inevitably try to flee. While Mai made a bored sound in reply, Tai Li seemed unsatisfied with the answer. The princess bit back a sigh. Plus, I thought it'd be nice to have a bonding session with old friends. There. As expected, the noble circus performer brightened up immensely. Well, I was hoping for maybe a trip to the markets or something. But this works too. There's a market down there. You know, AZULA replied, suppressing a smirk. Supposedly stocked with stuff outside of the Fire Nation. That caught Tai Li's interest, who then proceeded to ponder at the potential exotic souvenirs she could buy. Morning came with little incident. A small boat had tried to break through the blockade, but the Marines, hardened from the fighting in the North Pole, had easily boarded it and apprehended its water tribe crew. Another group of Earth Kingdom soldiers tried to sneak through the jungle surrounding the port town, but the colonial patrols hunted them down with ease. AZULA ordered all of the prisoners' release with a wave of her hand. It'd serve a decent enough message of the new management in the colonies. Along with Tai Li, and her ever-dutiful bodyguards, AZULA disembarked onto the largest dock of the town and was met immediately by a party of cowering traders. The mob tossed several bound and bruised men forward, as if offering sacrifices to a dark spirit. AZULA almost grinned at the description she conjured in her head. "And who are they?" she asked in an unamused tone. One of the better-dressed members of the mob answered. "That's the blasting jelly manufacturer and his people." Your Highness. How efficient of you." AZULA glanced down at the trussed-up men, and they stopped writhing and begging for mercy under her gaze. "Now then, none of you strike me as the kind to be stupid enough to try assassinating my brother. And I'm not so unreasonable to blame the spearmaker for a spearman's kills, so... Do any of you have any notion of who I can focus my attention on?" The crowd went into silent murmuring, and the bound men shared looks with each other, clearly terrified but also clearly clueless. "Idiots. Surely you have a ledger to track your transactions?" AZULA asked patiently. AZULA and her landing party followed the unbound staff back to their factory. Tai Li thankfully remained on the job and didn't let the stalls along the way distract her. And for all her bored expression, was keeping as keen an eye at their surroundings as the bodyguards. Rather boringly, there was no ambush at all along the way. Not even a hint of resistance or deception. Well, Xing did say that the boring operations were the successful ones. AZULA got a hold of the books, and it didn't take long for her to notice one particular name standing out with an obscenely large order. Zhao. Her head snapped up to lock onto the trembling factory owner. The Admiral former Admiral. Why yes, he came by to place a big order, the man said in a hurry. He asked us to deliver it to his intermediaries. So this might be interesting after all. And who exactly are these intermediaries? AZULA asked very politely. The party marched towards the still-anchored boutique ship with some haste. There was little worry that the wooden junk ship could escape the blockade, but it was better to get this over with quickly. Fortunately, AZULA saw some of the crew still scampering up the boarding ramp, as if their little vessel could offer them sanctuary. As they drew closer, she could even spot spears and other weapons poking out from behind the ship's railings. They don't seem to be willing to cooperate. Guards, disable the craft. The princess then turned to her friends with a thin smile. Come on, girls, I heard bonding through combat is a thing. The bodyguards took a page out of the 11th and blasted onwards with bursts of fire from their feet, hurling fireballs at the sails as they soared towards the back end of the ship. In the meantime, AZULA led Tai Li and straight for the boarding ramp. Flashes of steel from persuaded the ship's crew to let go of the ramp and seek cover, the throwing knives embedded deep into the wood. Tai Li closed the distance with a series of leaps and landed feet first onto a sailor's face. While she began dancing between the ship's crew, AZULA propelled herself to join her, catching a preoccupied man with a flying kick to the back of his head. A pair of bolas flew from somewhere, but a throwing blade intercepted it, cutting through the cord and rendering the balls spinning uselessly away. One of the larger sailors was prepared to launch a net from some contraption, which AZULA promptly dealt with a burst of blue fire that burnt through the net and knocked the man back. In the meantime, Tai Li darted between armed men, delivering a flurry of well-aimed punches that sent her victims slumping helplessly to the ground. Between Mai's precise throwing knives, Tai Li's paralyzing attacks, and AZULA's careful application of fire, with how varied these ruffians were, she couldn't tell who was the leader. They cleared the deck in under a couple of minutes. Chi Song and the bodyguards arrived just seconds later, reporting that the rudder had been successfully burnt away. Well, the boring operations were the successful ones. AZULA grinned at her newly secured captives. Now then, who here wants to make life easy for me and tell me about Zhao? It took only some force before they spilled the beans, and AZULA had to restrain herself and Mai from lashing out when the simpering captain revealed the pirates' involvement in almost killing Zuko. The princess sent an order to confiscate the ship, allowing her friends to take their pick of souvenirs before whatever's left was turned over to the royal coffers. As for the captives, she had them brought back for further questioning, and then they were marked to be sent back to the 11th's training ground as training aids. Maybe Zuko would appreciate the gesture. News filtered in of the Fire Nation's failure at the North Pole. While it was a good piece of news indeed, Hakoda hadn't expected its effect to be quite immediate. Thanks to that siege, the water lanes had been steadily left vulnerable for months, allowing the warriors of the Southern Water Tribe to harass supply ships and even sink isolated patrol boats. Hakoda had thought that his warriors would have a few more weeks of such easy pickings, but the Fire Nation had reorganized and recovered itself a bit too quickly, and their fleets returned to the southern half of the seas in vengeful force. Fueled by their humiliating defeat, the Fire Nation squadrons were far more aggressive now in their pursuit of Earth Kingdom and Water Tribe raiders. Hakoda's marauders learned it at a high cost when they ran into their first warship in a long time. The ship not only hounded the raiding flotilla with stubborn persistence, but it also sent out a signal flare that called in other squadrons. And soon Hakoda and his men found themselves fleeing from an enemy force 4 times their number in watercraft, never mind weight or manpower. Kajuk's boat was blasted apart by a lucky trebuchet hit, and he and his crew suffered an agonizing death as the waters around him were boiled by Firebender's constant barrage. Tarkuk, Lutak, and their vessel were broken by an oversized harpoon. Other boats were shattered or burnt, but skillfully weaving between the metal monstrosities, the remaining Water Tribe warriors were able to eventually wait for the winds to change and slip away from the chase. It was a miracle that only nearly half their number was lost from that, but Hakoda and his raiders were left stranded on the Earth Kingdom continent for the time being. Thankfully, the southern states were very generous with their aid, and thanks to the far-sighted plans laid by the captured King Bumi, the warriors of the Southern Water Tribe were not only rearmed and resupplied, but would soon have steam-powered boats of their own. King Bumi had initially had construction underway to hand these ships over to your people as soon as he could, but we had to restart production from scratch when the Fire Nation took over Omashu, Baron Yoru explained as he hosted the warriors in his spacious manner. There are shipyards established across various realms. The ships would still take a while to finish, unfortunately. Baron Yoru's news was comforting, and Hakoda was glad that the states of the Southern Earth Kingdom were still actively resisting the Fire Nation's conquest. Better than the laconic reaction of those in the East, at least. From all he heard about it, Ba Sing Se remained aloof and barely involved in the long war, only sending out their armies to rebuff advances towards the city and nothing else. The states around the impenetrable city were only safe because of their accidental proximity. In contrast, Baron Yoru and the other rulers of the southern states were in constant communication with one another, cooperating under the missing leadership of King Bumi, who had managed to not only rally them, but keep their support even after his capture. Our forces are being marshaled at Duke Hung's and Count Cao's lands, which borders captured Omashu. While they fight in the front lines, other states are channeling their resources towards ensuring the men are properly equipped and have enough to eat. Baron Yoru huffed a bit as he boasted of his own contributions. I've opened up mines in my land to feed the smelters. At the same time, the refugees have settled in to farm more land. With some more time, I'm sure that we can retake Omashu and free King Bumi. My warriors have been greatly diminished, but we can still fight if you'll have us. Hakoda offered the Baron, more than happy to join such an active coalition. His men were also eager to avenge the fallen, so the Water Tribe fighters took their raiding onto land. They had no benders, but hardened from fighting whale walruses and packs of polar bear hounds. The warriors held their own as they clashed with Fire Nation patrols behind enemy lines. Now armed with metal weapons and armor, Hakoda's raiders quickly became a force to be reckoned with. Fire-resistant lacquered shields allowed them to charge right at firebenders, while metal lamellar armor allowed them to fight through spear lines and hails of arrows. Hakoda was particular with his targets. His men only went after patrols or outposts and kept away from the settlements. The border towns and villages were all conquered Earth Kingdom people, after all, and liberating a town would be a short-lived thing. Until we can push them back, freeing a town in the middle of enemy territory might just see its inhabitants slaughtered when the Fire Nation returns in force. The Baron's reasoning was depressingly sound, so Hakoda did all that he could to keep the enemy's ruthless attention away from the innocent. Unfortunately, he realized too late that his force became too successful. For all their mobility and cunning, Hakoda awoke in the middle of one night to urgent news. "Hakoda, we have to move," Bateau said as he returned from his scouting in a panic. "Fire Nation forces are headed this way." A night march? That sounded desperate. Yet, how big? "Enough," his old friend answered with a gasp of air. "They bear the scorpion on their standard." The raiders immediately broke camp, knowing better than to seek a futile last stand. They were about to move out, but muted bursts from far away made Hakoda turn to the forest canopy. He didn't see anything but the movement of leaves, but that was enough for his warrior's instincts. "Everyone, ready yourselves for attack." Thankfully, that order was redundant, as his warriors were already rushing to arm themselves. The raiders of the Southern Water Tribe were just about to enter formation when shadows fell from the night sky and landed amongst them. The campfires gave the armored forms a menacing, blood-red appearance. Their faces were masked under chainmail veils, adding to their air of dread. "Surrender, raiders." The voice was young. Hakoda was briefly reminded of Sokka, and then his heart almost froze as he realized who was speaking. "Never, Scorpion." The chieftain grimly lowered his blade, and his warriors quickly closed into formation, shields forming a protective shell. The Scorpion shifted into a bending stance in response, and the expected barrage of fire did not appear. Instead, Hakoda gasped in surprise as the air around him turned colder than his home, snuffing out the campfire and causing his nose, mouth, and lungs to burn from the rush of cold air. The raiders staggered, reduced to shivering under their metal armor. Their formation faltered, and only then did the shadowy figures pounce. Calling it a fight would be too generous. Hakoda and his men were wrangled up with barely any resistance. "Never say never," came the Scorpion's voice as the faceless monster loomed over him. Seeing Xing's heat-bending in action was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The way the Water Tribe raiders just suddenly frosted over and gasped out cold clouds of air. The way the campfires crackled as they were snuffed out. There was something inherently unsettling about it that made the lieutenant colonel shudder. And yet, directly above Xing, a few bats dropped from the sky from the sudden, drastic increase in temperature, as what was leached from the raiders was shunted above the colonel. When Mosey took the time to inspect them, the flash-fried creatures showed no signs of charring, but they had dried blood staining every orifice, as if their eyeballs and innards had burst out. Again, it was not a good way to go. While some firebenders secured the prisoners before warming them up, Mosey took another squad to rifle through the raiders' belongings for any useful information. Their colonel, in the meantime, led another group to check for any potential stragglers. For better or worse, these raiders didn't own anything really of note. There was a rudimentary map, but no orders or anything approaching stored intelligence. The Earth Kingdom really had just equipped them and let them loose. Still, it was a testament to the Water Tribe warriors' abilities that they wreaked so much damage that the princess tasked the 11th to deal with the issue. Despite their small numbers, these men had raised dozens of outposts, ravaged several barracks, and left slaughtered more than 4 times their number in Fire Nation garrison guards. Mosey briefly wondered what his commander would do with these prisoners. Even in the early days, Xing had a strange soft spot for the tribals, giving them far more respect than many of his peers did not. Maybe it's because he bonded with Kylan and her group of prisoners so closely. Mosey couldn't really be sure of that, but he was almost certain that the latest batch of prisoners would be finding themselves surprised at the soft treatment they'd be getting. With nothing but personal belongings to gather, Mosey waited for Xing to return before sending off a bolt of fire into the air. And then it was a matter of waiting for a few minutes before a rumbling growl was heard from deep in the darkness. Lantern lights betrayed the arrival of a small fleet of tracked transports. Based off the tanks that had performed rather well in the Northern Air Temple and the invasion of the North Pole, the longer, open-topped vehicles proved to be excellent transports, requiring only one firebender to power its motor and a driver to steer the thing in exchange for ferrying almost a score of soldiers around. Mosey could see these tracked carriers become a new staple in the Fire Army. As marvelous as the contraption was, it still paled compared to what the Earth Kingdom, Ba Sing Se in particular, was pulling off. They had basically been building larger versions of the carriages that the great city used for their famed monorails, and used earthbenders to push it and its cargo around. Last reports from the east stated that those things could disgorge about 50 men, and General Wa had been publicly appalled that such information had not been taken seriously until she took the reins of the army. Mosey could understand her anger. If the Earth Kingdom could redeploy and reinforce so many troops so quickly, it would greatly change the calculus for battle. Ba Sing Se could theoretically send out an endless human wave on a front, wearing it down by attrition or forcing the Fire Nation to draw its strength from other areas. Then it could just as quickly move all that manpower to the weakened spots. Hopefully, this tracked carrier would help even the scales a bit. Xing initially had trouble commissioning them, but with War Minister Qin's demise, he had found a candidate for the office who sought out the Crown Princess, and therefore the 11th's support. As a result, he accepted Xing's commission, and now the whole regiment and its supply train fully traveled in the vehicles. Some people still found the ride unnerving, but Mosey personally found it far more agreeable than wagons. Suspensions and simple cushioned seats did wonders for long travel, and the metal hulls offered an obvious sense of protection. The raiders were led to the transports with jaws hanging and eyes boggled. Mosey wasn't that naive to think that the display of technology would awe them. The warriors were likely already trying to pick apart at what they saw in their minds. This area is clear, no signs of other raiders, Xing said casually as he joined his second in command. We'll quickly head back to camp and settle in the prisoners, then leave the interrogation for after the sun rises. As you say, sir. Mosey took separate transport from Xing, a safety precaution according to the colonel, and allowed himself to relax as he returned to camp without having to walk or fire bend. The regiment's camp was bustling as it usually was at night, with the night shift keeping guard and a few of the non-combatants still up doing chores. Li Ming would likely be waiting for Mosey in his tent, and it was that motivation that made the lieutenant colonel speed through the closing of the operation. The prisoners were led off to the guarded compound. Xing issued his final orders before heading to bed himself, and the seized items would be stored away for Fudu. Mosey turned along with Xing and the others at a commotion in the distance. One of the prisoners, the tribal chieftain, had frozen in place for some reason. As the two commanders hurried over to find out exactly why, Mosey saw Kylan, Yuka, and some of the other Water Tribe prisoners ready to welcome the new intake staring with equal confusion at the man. It was only when the chief spoke that things clicked. Annie Kylan? Of all the things she expected, Kylan did not see a family reunion happening at all, least of all her brother's son. It had taken her a while to actually figure out what was so familiar about him, but when Hakoda called out, Kylan let out an involuntary gasp as she finally saw the traces of Nico on his face. Her legs almost gave way, but Kylan managed to stagger forwards as Yuka held her up for support. Hakoda, the nephew she had once thought lost quickly, ran up to her, and even through her own blurring vision, she could see the tears welling up in his eyes. Kylan sniffed as she tightly embraced Hakoda, not minding at all that he kept calling her name. Nico was always the emotional one. It's no surprise that his son inherited it. We thought you were dead, Hakoda rasped once they settled down in the main camp. The other prisoners sat around them, not hiding their interest at all. Even Yama wasn't pretending to be asleep. They said your village was melted to the ground. But Kylan had been captured instead of killed. She distinctly remembered the bittersweet consolation that she was the one that made the move to this village, and not her brother and his new family. They caught me, the healer replied. But on the way back, the ship got caught in a storm. I and the other waterbenders managed to break everyone out. And the ship. She remembered the vengeful satisfaction of joining with the others in ripping the warship with an explosion of ice. Then, why didn't you return home? Kylan smirked dryly. We couldn't see where we were floating to, and before we knew it, we ended up in Earth Kingdom land. We also learned that the Fire Nation were out hunting for waterbenders, so returning home would only lead them to our loved ones. She fought the frown and the voice in her head that nagged at her. She did not want to admit that she still was too incensed at Nico to consider even thinking about him as a loved one. Stupid family fights being stupid, really. But Kylan couldn't stand her brother's attempts to arrange a marriage for her. And with his brutish and unbearable friends too. The bloody nerve of it all. The elder shook her head of the sour thoughts to return to the more pleasant present. Now that she had the time to appreciate it, Hakoda seemed more and more like Nico, down to his brow movements and the quirk in his lips when he pronounced certain words. I thought you were all gone too, Kylan admitted. Heard they were conducting raids, and they had raised Yak Bay. We fled to Wolf Cove. Dad found their ships approaching. Well, Nico did have a talent for slipping out of trouble. So you were in the Earth Kingdom all this while? Hakoda asked with a concerned frown. He even had the same ridges on his forehead as his father when he did that. Kylan shrugged. More or less. She and the others had banded together and joined with the first Earth Kingdom state they met, serving as healers and fighters as their talents allowed them to. Fought with Duke Shuwei for a while, and then I left, because he couldn't take no as an answer. And she couldn't see herself as an Earth Kingdom Duke's lady, no matter how much he tried to make her. She let out a heavy sigh. Then I got captured. I fled, then fought with another Earth Kingdom state. Kylan smiled a bit, remembering the late Countess Sue and her very warm welcome. A shame she had to marry such a useless lout to keep her legacy going. And eventually I got captured again. Her smile faded as the darker memories made their appearance. Hakoda looked appalled. You've been a prisoner of the 11th for so long? Kylan's eyes went wide at the misunderstanding, ignoring Yama's derisive snort as she quickly shook her head. What? No. The Fire Nation held me prisoner in one of their towns. It was an ugly time. She closed her eyes for a second, forcefully banishing back the soul-crushing memories of countless years in a dark cell, or the dark leers of her captors. Popping sounds drew Kylan back to the present, and she slowly unclenched her fists. A quick surge of chi mended the slight damage the waterbender did to her own joints. Anyway, eventually I was transferred here. Transferred. Kylan offered a wry smirk, one that several other prisoners like Yuka mirrored. The folks here at the 11th decided that I served a better purpose here than languishing in a cell. Hakoda did not stop looking utterly revulsed. Kylan waved away his unsaid concerns. Oh, don't worry, they treat us well here. Took a bit of time for me to believe them. But the 11th are good people, for Fire Nation captors anyway. They, well, mostly Xing if she was right. Burned down the barracks Yuka had been kept in. Again, it was Xing with his little band of accomplices. Let her and the other prisoners satisfy their bloody vengeance on their former jailers as a show of trust. Kylan remembered the bright smile Xing wore when he offered her a dagger in front of the trussed-up victims. Rusty and chipped, so it'll hurt more. You'll want to be careful between the legs. She remembered a younger Ping saying as she scowled at the bound rapists and sadists. Kylan still remembered the young woman's old wounds before she healed them away. Cut them wrong and they'll bleed out too fast. Kylan remembered her own dark smile at that time as she nicked herself with the dagger and healed the jagged wound before her surprised benefactors. Oh, don't worry. I'll be sure they make it through the night. Ignoring Hakoda's skeptical look, Kylan offered a reassuring smile as she bended out some water into the teapot someone considerately brought over. Anyway, enough about me for tonight. What about you? How are you here? Surely you should be a proud father by now. Kylan almost shattered the teapot by freezing it too quickly when she heard of what led her nephew here. As the skies began to brighten to herald the dawn, Kylan fought off her weariness and followed a soldier to Xing's tent. She didn't really need an escort, but it didn't hurt to be formal for things like this. Elder Kylan, you're still awake? He inquired as he welcomed her in and dismissed the guards. She entered with as warm a smile as she could manage, inured by now to the trust he showed her by keeping his bodyguards outside. Hopefully it's just excitement from reuniting with family. Kylan decided to get to the point. The boy wasn't one for beating around the bush anyway. Unfortunately, no. My nephew, Hakoda. I learned that he had lost his wife some years ago. My condolences, Xing said softly with a bow of his head. She died protecting her daughter, my grandniece, from a Fire Nation raider. Xing stood silently still, nodding at Kylan to continue. I've not asked much from you before, Xing, but Dash, the young firebender, raised a hand to interrupt her, nodding once more with a familiar coldness in his eyes. I'll see what I can do, Elder. Please get some rest. Thank you, Xing. Kylan made to kneel in gratitude, but the boy came up to stop her. None of that, Elder. His smile was soft and reassuring. I owe you my life many times already. This is nothing. Kylan left the tent with a sense of relief. One way or another, Xing would help seek vengeance, she knew it. After days of traveling with the 11th, Hakoda stood in shock with his men before the Scorpion. He had to admit that until now their captors had been nothing but respectful, and the chief still found it hard to believe that none of the monstrous tales about the defiant 11th and its young dragon applied to their prisoners. Auntie Kylan and the other prisoners had been practically gushing in their praise of their Fire Nation guards, even considering them more as protective guardians than malevolent jailers. Not that they glossed over the atrocities the regiment had committed, but a certain perspective was added. Yes, they beat back Earth Kingdom armies by throwing mutilated bodies or starving out whole formations. But the gruesome tactics were employed to break morale and encourage the enemy to flee. The surly General Yama of the Earth Kingdom had strangely remarked that the 11th actually killed far less than other formations, but paradoxically admitted that they also probably killed far more soldiers than anyone else. Hakoda had to take some time wrapping his head around that idea, until someone told him about Earth Kingdom peasant conscripts. It made a twisted kind of sense then, but it still did not sit well for him. These men and women were not merciful or benevolent. They still fought to conquer. They still ruthlessly swept aside any opposition in their way. Being honorable through dishonorable acts only gave them so much allowance in Hakoda's eyes. Yet here he was all of the sudden, with his men, assembled outside of the regiment's camp with a bag of supplies slung under each warrior's arm. The Scorpion stood before him, smirking faintly. "I owe the good elder a favor, a lot of favors, actually. So here." The boy raised a scroll in his hand, waving it about slightly. "This is a map containing information regarding a particular group of Fire Nation raiders." That immediately caught Hakoda's attention, as well as several of his comrades. "I heard that the leader of this particular group of raiders was responsible for killing an innocent mother." Hakoda had to suppress a growl at the dark reminder. The Scorpion's eyes narrowed into a steely glare. "I might misplace this scroll when my unruly prisoners decide to suicidally break free and escape. Maybe it's because one of them hid a bone knife up their ass or something." The scroll lowered, and Hakoda almost lunged at it before the Scorpion pulled it back up again. "But I'd have it on your word or your honor, or whatever it is you hold dear, that you will only seek out the names found on this map. No family members, no collateral. If they're already dead, you can piss on their graves and defile it, but do not take it out on anyone else." The boy's glare somehow managed to turn sharper. "Otherwise, I'd have to kill the elder for abusing my trust, and then I'll be petitioning the royal court for a visit to the South Pole." Hakoda and his men nodded at the mutual gift and threat. It was more than a fair request. "After that, after all the names here are crossed off, you will go back and defend your homes and raise your children." The chief was mildly surprised that the Scorpion didn't ask for their return as prisoners. He'd have gladly done so, considering the generous gift of vengeance. "Thank you, none of that." The boy cut in with a wave of the scroll. "I'm doing this for your auntie, but also so that you can tell the other Southern Water Tribe folks you come across to go back to the South Pole and stay out of the continent. With the coming daring escape, my regiment might not be keen on taking further prisoners from the south." Hakoda bowed deeply, and his men followed along. "I understand. Thank you, Colonel, for this chance. Maybe next time we'll meet in friendlier circumstances." He paused for a second, and then smiled almost wistfully. "I'll see if I can convince Elder Kylan to go down to visit her grandniece and nephew." The Scorpion gave a final nod, and then casually dropped the scroll before turning away. "I'm sure Sokka and Katara would be grateful for the opportunity to meet." Hakoda paused, noting the boy uncharacteristically stumbling in his steps, and then quickly turning back to him. "They're your kids." Iroh mentally braced himself as he stepped off the meager jetty of Silver Eel Island and began his walk inland. It wasn't too long a walk. The small island could barely hold a fishing village, let alone a noble's compound. Yet it was here that such a compound managed to squeeze in, its neat white walls marking its borders standing out behind the scattering of huts and nets. Iroh reached the gates and gave it a short knock, and then announced himself to the sleepy-eyed servant that greeted him. "Please wait," he said despite the surprise at meeting a prince in person, and the gate closed shut. Iroh let out a sigh and slumped a bit. He didn't even try to cover up his nervousness. In his head, he ran through the possible routes the meeting might take. At the same time, another part of him berated himself for not coming here sooner. Minutes later, the gates opened again, this time fully, but Iroh knew better than to move when he saw the aged lady of the household scowling at him. "You," the prince grimaced at the tone. Time had not weakened the venom in her voice. Drawing in a steadying breath, Iroh bowed from his side of the gate. "Lady Sue, how dare you show your face here, Iroh?" The deep lines on the old woman's face accentuated her anger and revulsion, though her servants looked nervous at her lack of courtesy in addressing a royal. "Leave." She didn't have to say more. The last time they met, the widow had made it clear that Iroh's presence would never be welcome. Time hadn't weakened that sentiment either. "Please, Lady Sue, I've come to apologize." "Your apologies are worthless to me," she snapped. "They've always been worthless. I was just a fool to realize it too late." Iroh winced, but did not rise from his bow as guilt and shame began to bubble up in him. As before, he couldn't find the words to form a suitable reply. She had every right to despise him as she did. "Well, why are you still here?" He finally, slowly, rose up, braving the widow's enraged glare. "I wish to make amends dash. Then give me back my sons." Sue wailed, raw emotions cracking through. "Return my husband." Iroh flinched and found himself unable to meet her hateful, tearing eyes as guilt and shame grew from gnawing to oppressive. I'm sorry. I already said that means nothing. Now leave." "Lady Sue, please dash, don't you dare enter," she snapped, stabbing a finger towards him to stop Iroh from taking a step forward. The prince backed away, keeping a few paces away from the gate, and tried to plead his case again. He quickly brought out an officious scroll of silk and paper. "Lady Sue, I come to give you a new home." She looked far from impressed. "What? Is this island not small enough for me?" she spat. "No, please, this is the deed to Fire Sands Island. Your family's old holding." That made Sue pause for a second, but her glare did not ease up. Why should I want it back? There's nothing there but bad memories. And I will not have anything to do with you anymore." Iroh sighed. "I did not buy this deed. It is Colonel Shing who appealed to the crown princess for it." Finally, the harsh look receded a bit as the widow showed some surprise, before it was smothered with a disapproving frown. "The boy that Li Dai was so fond of. It took him a while to obtain the deed. It was only with its owner's recent troubles that he managed to secure it. He wishes for you to have it." Sue scoffed, but she finally broke her glare to look away. "Another insufferable group of sycophants. At least he and the rest of my husband's soldiers have the courtesy of leaving immediately when I tell them to." There was resentment in her voice, but not as intense as her hatred for Iroh. The prince mildly envied the 11th for that. The old matriarch snapped back to him again. "What does the boy want for this?" "Access to Li Dai's shrine, I presume." "Shing only asks for you to accept this deed," Iroh said as he slowly walked forwards to place the scroll right at the gates. "He will still respect your wish to be undisturbed by the regiment." There was a moment of silence as the woman clearly picked through any possible hidden agenda in that. "Humph. At least he's smart enough to understand that," she grudgingly admitted. Then Sue fixed her glare on him again. "And you? What do you want out of this?" As annoyed as Iroh was at the accusation, he had to remind himself that from where she stood, he deserved to be her enemy. "I do not want anything dash. Please, Iroh," she said with such contempt that he grimaced. "You've always taken from me and my family. First my cousin's betrothed, then my husband's reputation, then my family's standing, and finally my son's. What will it be this time? What little dignity I have left? My life." Once more the prince felt the guilt and shame beat down on him at her accusation, and he knew that in her eyes she was right on each count. Iroh had met Hitomi by sheer chance and had been entranced from the start, and only learned of her betrothal after he had fully won over her heart with his charms. His standing as a prince easily convinced her family to break off her previous engagement to Sue's cousin Saifong, who had been so heartbroken that he committed suicide shortly after, that had earned Sue's resentment. As for Li Dai, Iroh's belittling insults against his friend for his approach to war had set the sycophants in court and the military against Li Dai, which due to Iroh's own inaction snowballed into a rather heinous character assassination. Iroh's lack of intervention was what condemned his old senior to decades in the colonies, just as it allowed the nobility to prey on Li Dai's family like a flock of lion vultures. Li Dai's family had its influence whittled down to barely be considered a noble family, that had earned Sue's disgust and revulsion. He had been naive and foolish back then to not consider the ruthlessness of the upper nobility. just as he was equally naive and foolish to try and rectify that by taking on Li Dai's 2 sons under his command. Iroh was supposed to give them opportunities to gain merits and acclaim, but instead his aggressive tactics sent them to their deaths. Deaths that were, in hindsight, clearly avoidable with more grounded strategies. But everyone else commended the Crown Prince for his decisive recklessness, especially since it resulted in a victory that had earned Su Wei's undying hatred. Li Dai eventually forgave him for that crime, but Li Dai was the kind of man that could forgive just about anything. His wife would likely curse Iroh's name even beyond her dying breath, and his guilt over the incident had the prince acquiescing to the bereaved matriarch's demand to never sully their memories by even thinking of their names. He remembered how she had conducted their funerals practically in secret and alone, her husband unable to see off their children because he was stuck fighting battle after battle on the Earth Kingdom continent to prove himself to his peers. It had been a far smaller service than the officers deserved, mostly because of their family's diminished station and wealth. He remembered his offerings of condolences being thrown back at him when he finally mustered the courage to meet the grieving mother. All I see is shrouded in a haze of despair. All I taste is the ashes of loss. I do not care for your sympathy or for you at all, Iroh. I can only wish that you die as shunned and alone as I am now. That was her curse on him on their last meeting, and the words had haunted Iroh for years. It was what drove him to appreciate his family even more. It had loomed over and almost broke him when Lu Ten fell in battle. Iroh got down on his knees and, to the gasps of the servants and some passers-by noticing the meeting, prostrated in front of the woman who had endured much because of his actions and inactions. I ask for nothing, Lady Su Wei, save for only the hope that you'll eventually find it in you to forgive me for the things my presence has inflicted onto you and your family. Never, she sneered. Never. Not even if the spirits commanded me to. Not even in 1,000 lifetimes. With a sigh, Iroh got back up and resigned himself to her enmity. All the prince could do now was hope that it did not spread to the men and women that dutifully followed Li Dai. Hate me then, but please accept Fire Sands Island. He nodded to the scroll still lying on the ground. It is already in your name, and Xing only wishes to repay your husband's generosity. Su Wei glanced down at the deed, and then snorted with derision. All the anger faded away from her, and she slumped with a tired sigh. Since Li Dai was so fond of him, let him keep the miserable island. I have nothing there. It means nothing to me now. I'm sure you can dash. Don't tell me what to do with my life, Iroh. She quickly snapped, and then receded to a thoughtful expression. Tell the boy. Tell him that he can do with Fire Sands as he wishes. He'll have my blessing for it. Iroh sighed heavily at that, drawing her ire. Xing expected you to say that, he explained before she could snap at him again. Iroh produced a small note from within his sleeve and offered it to a servant, who then passed it to the matriarch. Su Wei read through the paper with a frown, her eyes going increasingly wider towards the end. She glanced up to him, but Iroh could only shrug in return. He didn't understand the significance of the mansion Xing had described he'd like to build, or the offer to have Su Wei employed in the palace, under AZULA, but it amounted to the same thing. He's building this? She eventually asked. The prince nodded slowly, trying to grasp the hidden meanings here. With your permission. For the first time in this meeting, all hostility left Lady Su Wei, and she stared blankly at the note. If I may as dash, she shushed Iroh into silence, and he bit back a weary sigh before she suddenly answered the question she interrupted. Li Dai once promised me he'd elevate us into the royal court proper. Su Wei spoke to no one in particular, her expression taking on a melancholic, faraway look. Once we made it in, he'd see to it that our holdings would be improved. He'd get me a manor. She absently rubbed at the paper with her thumbs and fingers. A large, spacious manor with a magnificent garden, with a gardener for each tree, each bush, each vine trellis. Iroh found himself smiling. It was very considerate, and by now very typical, of the boy to try and fulfill his adoptive grandfather's dreams. Even in part. We'd need those servants, he said, because we'd both be too busy. Him as a general, and me as a royal handmaiden. The woman heaved a sigh and shook her head, harshly dispelling her old memories. Of course, then you happened. Iroh tried not to flinch at that casual accusation, but it was a poor attempt. Su Wei took several steps closer towards the gate, enough to close the distance and allow her to squat down to pick up the scroll herself with a bone-weary groan. She sharply waved off the servants that tried to help her, and eventually got back up slightly winded, the deed in hand. The matriarch then extended her arm across the gate's threshold, offering the scroll over to Iroh. Tell the boy. Tell Colonel Xing that I gratefully accept his offer. Despite the lack of anger, Su Wei still wore a stern expression that glowed with contempt for Iroh. I will move in as he asks, and he and his regiment are more than welcome to pay their respects to my husband once the shrine is built. Her eyes narrowed to send a final stab of hatred at him. Unless something significant happens, I hope that this will be the last time I see you, Iroh. While Iroh was glad to see Su Wei again, even if she still despised him, while he was glad that Xing had asked him to carry out this painful but necessary task, while he was glad to be able to help rebuild part of her old life, Iroh couldn't help ponder as he walked back to the jetty about what AZULA and Xing stood to gain from all this. Was this purely out of Xing's gratitude to Li Dai, or was there some hidden angle here to consider? Zuko got up to the sound of war drums banging discordantly, and immediately rushed out of his cot, grogginess be damned. He had until the drums stopped to find and reach the assembly area, which hopefully hadn't shifted too far today. Thankfully, he made it well before the drums stopped. The rest of his group had assembled as well, despite the obvious lack of sleep many of them suffered from. 2 recruits were still smeared in mud and twigs. The luckier intakes down the line had long ago learned to not gawk at the unruly mess the night training batch suffered through. Good morning, recruits. Captain Rin barked out from the raised stage in front of the assembly ground. Good morning, Captain, came their shouted reply, almost in unison. Another day, another step closer to earning the right to serve in the 11th. Yay, ma'am. We can't wait, ma'am. Zuko had learned upon his inception into the regiment to push just the barest amount of enthusiasm in the replies. Captain Rin didn't exactly single him out, but she definitely noticed any mistakes or poor attempts that he made far quicker compared to others. She still glared daggers at him, but Zuko found it easy enough to avoid the grudge-bearing woman outside of training. The other instructors were almost as harsh, but their controlled malice was equally distributed throughout every recruit. Win stupid prizes, as someone had said, and thankfully Zuko's previous martial training as a prince had kept him clear from suffering any of their creative punishments. That was what probably kept Captain Rin pissed at him. Now whose turn is it to lead? The head instructor asked, her head scanning the crowd. She randomly yelled out a name, and 4 poor sods had to step forwards. Surprising, considering that Lao was a rather common name. Zuko thought there'd be a bit more of them. All 4 headed up to the raised stage, and the whole assembly, recruit and instructors alike, snapped into a ready stance. Even the most sleep-deprived aspirant suddenly adopting a highly alert look. At the edges of the grounds, a quartet of instructors began to pound at the drum again, this time slowly building up a rhythm. Zuko counted down the beats as the drumming plateaued until another group of elderly instructor musicians entered with horns, Eru and Guzheng to create a rousing melody. The Laos led the morning drills, and the assembly followed after them. It was a simple form, ideal for the young and elderly alike, but with constant repetition and the background music stirring them. The air cracked as recruits and training instructors alike punched and kicked as one with deadly intent. Even outside the grounds, a good number of non-training staff were mirroring the motions with ease. Captain Ren's daughter was also part of it, sporting a comically serious frown and her stuffed toy dragons hanging off her as the girl followed along with surprising competence. Supposedly, there were lyrics to go along with it, words that only the veterans of the 11th truly knew. Occasionally, Zuko could hear them, even Captains Run and Kai, mouthing the foreign words during morning drills. It had to be words instead of nonsensical noises, because the veterans of the 11th could proudly tell you which syllables to emphasize and what the whole song meant. Because, of course, Xing taught the regiment the song and provided almost a syllable-by-syllable translation of the thing. Even without the lyrics, it was music to rouse the spirit, and Zuko found the few minutes of drilling to it to be one of the most enjoyable parts of his whole training. And after discovering what the song was supposed to mean, it made the whole thing even better. No wonder the tune was hummed all over the place. The drill ended just as the music did, and most of the recruits returned to their ready stance with a sheen of sweat on them. With no one fouling up, Captain Ren skipped the verbal flaying and dismissed them for breakfast. Private Zuko. My office after your meal. Maybe he spoke too soon. Zuko suppressed a sigh and headed for the mess hall. Private, it's clear that basic training is wasted on you, Captain Ren said once they had convened in her office. Her husband was there too, almost frowning as he regarded Zuko. The prince remained quiet, knowing better than to reply to the statement. So putting you through the rest of the course is frankly overly redundant and a waste of time. Rin gave a sigh before she smirked. Therefore, it's been decided that you will enjoy an accelerated program. You will undergo night training effective tomorrow. You will undergo the full course before we move you on to advanced intermediate tactics. The smirk faded, and her eyebrows rose instead. Any questions? What about my squad? From what he understood, recruits were grouped into squads for the entire duration of their training, and only broken up for specializations, or once they were deployed to refill missing ranks. It was Kai who answered him. You will be assigned to a new one, and a new one after that. It's not that uncommon for trainees to drop out or skip modules. Run steepled her fingers and rested her chin in the cradle of her fingertips. The Crown Princess and the Colonel want you out there as soon as they can. Your sister assures me that as average as you are, you could still speed through our training regimen in under half the time. Do you think you can do that, Private Zuko? Zuko gulped quietly, understanding the challenge he's been given. He didn't give it much thought and gave a sharp nod in reply. Yes, ma'am. Good. For the convenience of everyone, you will be reassigned to a different bunk. Zuko didn't understand why that was needed, until a group of instructors almost broke down the door of his newly assigned barracks in the middle of the night and literally set a fire under the waking trainees to get them assembled outside. Night training was 4 weeks of utter torment, where Zuko had to struggle through sleep deprivation as he lay in the mud in ambush or marched around the whole regiment's grounds under moonless nights. He learned how to endure being trampled on under his camouflage trapdoor, how to quickly wake up to a ready state, and how to appreciate moonlit nights. If anything, as much as it was hell for the prince, most of his peers had it worse, especially the nobles. In the first few weeks, their groans and whispered complaints gave their positions away, bringing down the instructor's wrath on them. Zuko saw most recruits drop out during one of the last ambush lessons, enduring 2 sleepless nights and a forced march before being ordered to quickly dig basically a shallow grave to bury themselves in broke not only the middle and upper class recruits, but also those from lower strata of society. Zuko himself barely kept his wits on as his hands with their cracked skin trembled for days later. What was surprising was that lesson, along with others, were based on the 11th's own experiences on campaign. And if Ruan and the instructor's boasting was accurate, then the training was all watered down compared to the hellish experience they went through. Under Xing's provisional rule, they did 4 days and nights of constant marching to escape a cavalry division, and decided to bury themselves and let the ostrich horses stampede over them to chase after false trails. Captain Kai had once literally holed up with a squad for 2 nights before popping out to burn down a camp's stores. It'd be easy to dismiss it all as bombastic exaggerations, but with what Zuko had read of the regiment, and what he went through with their training, the prince found himself worryingly believing the claims, and he did not look forward at all in trying to replicate any of them in the future. Still, night training was assured by the older recruits to be the worst of it, and Zuko was about to reach the end of it. And so far the training was overall actually an enjoyable experience. There was a strange relief in no longer holding any command. Following orders might stress his body, but it was much more preferable to the burdens of leadership straining his mind. It was also almost petty how much he enjoyed being recognized. His fellow recruits quickly ignored his royal status and accepted him as one of their own, and they were unabashed in their admiration of his talents with fire bending and the blade. Both Run and Kai might still harbor a grudge, but they still praised his dueling forms and combat instincts, however begrudging the praise was. Allies or enemies, we try not to downplay their accomplishments or exaggerate their flaws on strategic and tactical levels, Run had explained with a soft scowl. The 11th learned both the hard way. If we can't acknowledge both the good and the bad, we can't plan for them. All in all, Zuko was looking forward to finishing his training and seeing what life as a line infantry was like. I swear, I might have to ask Father to reconsider his methods for this. Tai Li feigned a carefree smile as AZULA muttered at the paper she had received. They were headed back to Zilong when a messenger hawk dropped off a small scroll at Hai Sin's post office. The scowl the princess gave was far greater than the jealous green-pink one she unconsciously formed when she received a message from the 11th, which probably did not bode well for the trio. "What's the problem?" Mai asked with a sideways glance at AZULA. "Your colonel sparred with another girl?" "Shin can spar with whoever he likes," came the snappy, defensive retort before she tossed the message over to Mai. "I've been invited to witness the deployment of something I rather not attend." Mai read through it with bored eyes, and then considerately passed the message on to Tai Li. "They're going to deploy a weapon to break Boss Sing Se. Isn't that a good thing?" From what she read, it did look rather ambitious. AZULA was being given front-row seats to witness a great weapon to tear down the walls of the great city, and Chief Engineer Gunso promised that she'd be the first to step foot into the captured city. It sounded like a typical grandiose offer, which made AZULA's reaction all the more surprising. "It'd be a good thing if it would actually deliver," the princess explained with a sigh. "I have eyes on that project, and everything about it screams disappointment. It's just an unwieldy drill that's going to waste lives, even getting to the walls. Not to mention the metal that could have been used to build other, more useful things." AZULA, the ruthless, hyper-competitive princess, caring first about lives? Once more, Tai Li had to suppress her surprise. Things have been changing so much with that girl that it was already proving this little excursion to be more than worth it. Mai was not as good at masking her expression, her eyes going wide for a moment. But thankfully the princess either didn't notice it or didn't care. Ugh, it really seems that the courtiers back home are really that incompetent to allow this stupid plan to go forward. "So, you're going to reject their offer?" Tai Li asked, already imagining the verbal evisceration that would follow. Shockingly, AZULA shook her head. "Obviously not. I'll be going along. The chief engineer might be an idiot, but the people under him might be salvageable. I can't have the fool waste such potential." She took the scroll off Tai Li and turned to the postmaster, who had been carefully not listening to the conversation. "Deliver my reply. Tell them I'll be happy to personally witness their weapon in action. I should be at the staging grounds in a few weeks." Mai gave her royal friend a curious, as much as Mai did curious, look. "You could send over an army or two to help it if you're that worried?" AZULA shook her head with some angry orange frustration. "It's not that simple. No, it'd make things worse. I've had High General Shina check the numbers. Protecting something too big like that would threaten everything else we have on the continent. The amount of idiots riding on Gunsa's little plan must be significant indeed to have my father's approval. Idiots that are also in father's war council. Well, at least you'll get to identify them after this." Quite. They watched the hawk being sent off before AZULA generously tipped the postmaster, and the trio left for their ostrich horses. "I suppose on the bright side, I have a few promotions to plan." AZULA suddenly paused, and then turned back to hastily march back to the postmaster before either Tai Li or Mai could ask. "I want a hawk, red ribbon priority. Send it to the 11th Regiment's barracks in Zilong. Recipient is exclusively for Colonel Xing."
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going. Plus, it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.